Section 1. Welcome to Gravity Falls, the town that holds its breath. There is a small town somewhere in the mountains of Oregon. The kind of place you could drive past 100 times and never notice, not because it is invisible, but because it is the sort of place that does not want to be noticed. The roads that lead into it are narrow and winding and poorly signed, the kind that seem to curve back on themselves before eventually straightening out into something almost familiar. The trees that line those roads are old, the kind of old that precedes any human record of them, tall and dark and thickly planted, their canopies interlocking overhead so that driving beneath them feels like moving through a long green tunnel with no visible end. The air is cold even in summer, carrying in it the smell of pine resin and creek water, and something else, something with no name, something that sits at the back of your throat and makes you feel slightly more awake than you were a moment ago. Watchful, aware that the watching is not entirely coming from you. At the edge of the town, at the place where the last stretch of highway meets the first street, there is a wooden sign. It is old. The paint has been weathered by enough Oregon winters to lose most of its brightness, but the letters are still legible if you slow down. They read, "Welcome to Gravity Falls." Below those words, in smaller letters, almost as if the sign maker added them as an afterthought, or perhaps as a warning so gentle it could be mistaken for boasting. The number one spookiest town in Oregon. Nobody in the town pays that sign any particular attention. The woman at the diner opens at the same time every morning. The post office runs on schedule. Children ride their bikes down the sidewalks of a main street that looks like the set of a movie about small-town American life, except that the details, if you look at them too closely, are slightly wrong in ways that are hard to specify but impossible to ignore. A store sign in a window that has been there since before anyone can remember, advertising a product that doesn't exist anymore, or perhaps never existed. A house at the end of a cul-de-sac whose occupant nobody has seen in longer than they can quite recall, but whose light is always on. The sound on certain nights of something moving in the forest at the edge of town that is larger than anything the forest is supposed to contain. The townspeople of Gravity Falls have lived with all of this for so long that most of them have simply decided not to think about it. This is not denial in the dramatic sense. It is something more practical and more human. The ordinary cognitive adjustment that people make when the alternative to not thinking is a kind of constant, low-grade terror that is simply not compatible with needing to get to work on time and remember what you were supposed to pick up at the grocery store. The town is strange. The town has always been strange. The town will continue to be strange in ways that no one in it can fully account for. And life goes on. This is the place Alex Hirsch created in 2012 when Gravity Falls premiered on Disney Channel and then migrated to Disney XD, where it continued until its final episode aired in February of 2016. Hirsch drew the show from memories and feelings, specifically from summers spent visiting roadside attractions in the Pacific Northwest with his twin sister Ariel. From the sensation of being a curious child in a world that seemed to have secrets adults were keeping from you. From the specific texture of a place that is beautiful and eerie and deeply invested in maintaining the performance of its own normality. The show was built around the experiences of two 12-year-old twins, Dipper and Mabel Pines, who are sent to spend the summer with their great-uncle Stanley Pines in his tourist trap, the Mystery Shack, in this particular small Oregon town. Dipper Pines, whose real name the show famously refuses to reveal on screen, though the supplementary materials suggest Mason, a question we will return to at considerable length, is the kind of kid who notices the things that don't add up. He is serious and curious and slightly anxious, with the particular intensity of a person who has been told their whole life that they are smart and has interpreted that as a mandate to figure things out. He arrives in Gravity Falls with a backpack and a notebook and no framework whatsoever for what he is about to walk into. His twin sister Mabel arrives with yarn for sweater knitting, a pig named Waddles that she wins in the first episode, and the kind of boundless optimism that somehow, improbably, turns out to be one of the most effective tools anyone deploys against the forces of supernatural darkness over the course of the show. Together, they are the center of the story. But the story, it turns out, is far larger than any two 12-year-olds. Gravity Falls ran for exactly 40 episodes across 2 seasons. 40. In television terms, this is not a long run. It is not the kind of show that has time to sprawl or wander or find its way. Everything in it had to be deliberate. Every mystery seeded with intention, every clue planted at the precise moment it could be found and used. Alex Hirsch has said repeatedly that he always knew how the show would end. Who the author of the journals was, what the secret of Grunkle Stan was, what Bill Cipher ultimately wanted, and how he would ultimately be stopped. He built backwards from those answers, laying in the questions with the precision of a person who is very sure of where they are going, and very interested in making the journey toward the destination as layered and rich as possible. And he succeeded, almost without precedent in children's animation. Gravity Falls built a mythology in 40 episodes, so dense and so carefully constructed that it has sustained years of active fan investigation and scholarship without revealing all of its foundations. There are things in the show that nobody has fully explained. There are mysteries that were seeded in the first season and never paid off in the second. There are questions that the show raised deliberately, knowing it would not answer them, because the raising of the question was itself the point. There are also questions that arose as a consequence of the show's ambitions exceeding its episode count. Stories that were planned but never told. Characters who were introduced and then not fully followed through. We're going to spend our time tonight going through all of them. The answered and the unanswered. The intentional mysteries and the accidental ones. The threads that lead somewhere and the threads that simply end. We're going to walk through the whole architecture of this remarkable, strange, deeply loving show and pay attention to all the places where the structure has gaps. Not because the gaps are failures, but because the gaps are where the most interesting questions live. To do this properly, we need to start at the beginning. Not with the first episode of the show, though we will return there. We need to start with the town itself. Because the central mystery of Gravity Falls is not who the author of the journals was. That gets answered. The central mystery is the town. Why here? What is it about this specific valley in the mountains of Oregon that made it the site of everything the show depicts? Why here and not anywhere else on Earth? Why is Gravity Falls the place where the dimensional barriers are thin enough for supernatural phenomena to bleed through on a daily basis? Why is this the place where an ancient cosmic entity spent centuries trying to engineer access? Why is this the place that drew Ford Pines and shaped his life and ultimately shaped the lives of his brother and his family across generations? The show gives us a partial answer. Ford explains in Season 2 that the Valley of Gravity Falls was formed millions of years ago by the crash of a large extraterrestrial spacecraft. The impact, massive enough to reshape the geology of the region, also damaged the dimensional barriers at that location, leaving them permanently compromised. This is the show's fundamental supernatural backstory. The weirdness of Gravity Falls is a scar, a wound in the fabric of reality, left by something that fell from the sky in a time before human memory. The valley is shaped the way it is, with its peculiar floating cliffs and its funnel-like geography because of what that impact did to the land. This is a significant piece of world building. It tells us that the supernatural concentration in Gravity Falls is not chosen or designed. It is accidental. A cosmic accident, millions of years old, that created a place where the rules were different, where things that couldn't exist elsewhere could persist, where something ancient and powerful, biding its time in a dimension adjacent to ours, could reach through and make contact. But the show gives us the fact of the spacecraft crash and nothing else. Whose ship was it? Where was it going? What was its purpose? And was that purpose relevant to what Gravity Falls eventually became? Did the inhabitants of that ship, if there were inhabitants, know what their crash was going to do to the location? Are there beings in the universe who know the full history of that impact and what it set in motion? These questions are never addressed. The spaceship exists as a plot device explaining the mechanism of the town's weirdness without telling us anything about the history that preceded the mechanism. It is, in many ways, the foundational mystery of the show. Everything else, Bill Cipher's plans, Ford's research, Stan's secret project, the journals, the Society of the Blind Eye, the portal, Weirdmageddon, everything else is downstream of that one ancient crash. The whole vast apparatus of the show's mythology is built on the fact of a ship that fell out of the sky in Oregon millions of years ago, and we never find out why it was there. There is also the question of what Gravity Falls is like before the events of the show. The town has had generations of residents. The Northwest family has been there since the 18th century, or claims to have been. There are indigenous histories in that valley that predate European settlement by unknown millennia. There are cave paintings depicting Bill Cipher that Ford finds during his research, drawn by people who understood the nature of the entity in their land well enough to try to contain it and warn those who came after. What happened in that valley across all those centuries? What forms did the supernatural activity take before Ford arrived and started documenting it? What knowledge was accumulated and then lost as generations turned over? And the town's particular amnesia, the active, engineered amnesia of the Blind Eye Society combined with the passive amnesia of a population that had simply decided not to pay attention, gradually swallowed the record? These are big questions. We will not exhaust them tonight. We will circle them, approach them from different angles, sit with them in the dark while the pine trees stand outside and the air carries that smell. Pine resin and creek water and something else. And let them do what good mysteries do, which is keep you company in the quiet. The show Alex Hirsch made is a show that trained its audience to pay attention, to look at backgrounds, to decode credits, to ask why a goat is looking at things, to wonder what is behind a locked door that nobody opens, and a name that nobody uses, and a tapestry hanging in a rich family's locked wing that has been there for 150 years. It trained this attentiveness with great care and then rewarded it generously, and then left deliberately, taking some answers with it and leaving others right where they were, hovering in the Oregon air, patient, cold waiting. For now, let's begin. Before we go any further into the forest, drop a comment below and tell me the time and where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love knowing where everyone is when they close their eyes and listen. And if this kind of slow, deep, atmospheric content is what helps you rest, please hit subscribe. It keeps this channel going and it means genuinely everything to me. Section 2, The Journals. 3 books, 30 years, and everything they didn't say. On the first day of Dipper Pines' summer in Gravity Falls, before the gnomes and the shapeshifter and the government agents and the demon triangle and all of it, he finds a book. It is tucked behind a loose board in the attic of the Mystery Shack, in a space that suggests it was hidden deliberately, wedged far enough back from the opening that you would only find it if you were already looking for something, or if you were the kind of person who couldn't leave a loose board alone once you'd noticed it was loose. The book is old. Its cover is hard and deep green, stamped with a gold 6-fingered hand on the front, and a large gold 3 on the spine. It smells of old paper and dust and something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a name, but that Dipper will come to associate with the town itself. That quality of being on the edge of something, of knowledge that is almost within reach. The journal is handwritten. The handwriting is careful, but not sterile. The kind of penmanship that was taught in schools before typing replaced it, with the occasional deviation from perfect letter forms that suggests the author was writing quickly in moments of excitement or urgency. The entries are dense. They describe in meticulous detail the supernatural fauna of the area around Gravity Falls. Gnomes, lake creatures, ghosts, apparitions, and entities of increasingly difficult classification as the pages progress. Each entry is accompanied by drawings of high quality, clearly made by someone with both artistic skill and the kind of compulsive accuracy that comes from caring very much about getting the details right. The drawings of creatures are not illustrations. They are records, evidence. The kind of documentation that someone might produce if they were genuinely afraid that nobody would believe what they were seeing, unless they could show exactly what it looked like. At the back of the journal, before the last few pages that warn against the summoning of a specific triangular entity, there is an entry that Dipper reads and rereads, because it tells him something he has already begun to suspect. The author was not simply a researcher gathering interesting data. They were frightened. Whatever they discovered in Gravity Falls, whatever they found at the bottom of all that careful documentation, it had reached the point where their primary concern was no longer data collection, but survival. The question of who wrote those words is the central mystery of the first season. It takes the entire first season and the first half of the second to fully answer, though the hints are there in the very first episode if you know what you're looking for. When the answer arrives, Stanford Pines Ford, the six-fingered twin brother of Stan, the person whose lab existed underneath the mystery shack all along, it is one of the most satisfying revelations in modern animated storytelling. It recontextualizes virtually everything that has happened, turns moments that seemed like background into load-bearing parts of the show's structure, and introduces a character whose history with Gravity Falls is so tangled and so long and so painful that it makes the town itself feel more alive for his having been in it. But here's where the journals become a mystery within themselves, layered atop the mystery of their authorship. There are three of them, numbered 1, 2, and 3. They were written over a period of years, covering different phases of Ford's research and his increasingly complicated relationship with the town, and with the entity he eventually came to understand was manipulating him. Why 3? Why not one continuous document? The answer Ford provides, when he finally explains himself, is practical and strategic. By dividing the information between 3 separate volumes and hiding them in different locations around the town, he ensured that no single person could gather enough information to activate the interdimensional portal on their own. You would need all 3 books to understand the full mechanism of the machine. This is logical. It is the kind of thinking that a person under serious threat trying to protect a dangerous secret would arrive at. But it has a flaw that the show acknowledges only in retrospect. The strategy assumed that the person most likely to try to use the journals would be someone with hostile intent who stumbled across one book and then had to find the others. It did not account for Stanley Pines, who spent 30 years methodically tracking down all 3 volumes out of love for his brother, and who then used the completed set of information to reactivate exactly the machine Ford was trying to prevent from being activated. Nor did it account for 12-year-old from California finding Journal 3 in an attic and walking directly into every dangerous situation the journal described, having no context for what any of it meant. The journals as objects have properties and histories that the show only partially explores. Journal 1, which Stan had in his possession throughout the show's first season, and which is revealed in the finale to have been sent to him by Ford in the immediate aftermath of the portal accident, covers Ford's first 3 years in Gravity Falls. It is the journal of a man still capable of something like wonder, still approaching the town's weirdness with the enthusiasm of a scientist who cannot quite believe his luck. The entries are detailed and careful, but not yet haunted. There is a lightness in the early pages that gets progressively harder to find as the volume progresses. Journal 2, which ended up in the hands of Gideon Gleeful through means the show never fully explains, covers the period when Ford's relationship with Bill Cipher was deepening and the Portal project was advancing. The entries become denser across the volume. There are pages that appear to have been written and then crossed out and rewritten, as if Ford was trying to work something out on paper and kept arriving at conclusions he didn't want to accept. There are entries that describe Bill's personality in terms that shift from admiring to cautious to quietly alarmed across the book's pages. There are instructions in Journal 2 for how to summon Bill. In Journal 3, there are instructions for how to stop Bill if he is summoned. The contrast between those two sets of instructions, written by the same person, in the same careful handwriting over a period of years, tells the whole story of Ford's relationship with the entity without any of it needing to be stated directly. Journal 3, the one Dipper finds, is the most urgent. It is the journal of a man in the late stages of understanding exactly what kind of trouble he is in. The warnings in it are not academic. They are personal. Ford has arrived by the time he is writing those pages at the knowledge that Bill is not what he presented himself as, that the collaboration was always a manipulation, that everything he was guided to build was built for Bill's purposes rather than his own. He is writing these pages knowing he may not survive to write more. He is hiding them knowing they may never be found by anyone who can understand them. The question of what the journals do not contain is as interesting as what they do. Ford was a meticulous note-taker, but he was also a person who was being watched. He knew by the later entries of Journal 3 that Bill could access his thoughts. He knew that anything he wrote down was potentially readable by an entity with effectively unlimited information-gathering capacity. This awareness must have shaped what he chose to document and what he chose to leave out. There are references in Journal 3 to pages that seem to be missing, entries that begin but don't have endings, references to previous documentation that doesn't appear to exist anywhere in the surviving volumes. Either those pages were removed by Ford deliberately before he hid the journal, or they were removed by someone who found the journal before Dipper did, or they were destroyed at some point in the journal's history. Ford himself mentions in Journal 3 that he suspected Fiddleford McGucket of being connected to the organization, systematically erasing the town's supernatural memories. He expresses this as a theory, a hunch, something he could not yet confirm. If he subsequently confirmed it, and he clearly had the intellectual capacity to confirm it eventually, that confirmation is not in Journal 3. It ended up being confirmed decades later by Dipper and Company in a completely separate line of investigation. But Ford suspected it, which means there may have been additional documentation, additional evidence that Ford gathered and then chose not to record in the journals that were eventually found. How did Gideon get Journal 2? This is a question the show raises and never answers. Gideon Gleeful, a 9-year-old child prodigy psychic con artist, had somehow acquired the second of Ford's 3 journals before the events of the show begin. The show's first season treats Gideon having the journal as an established fact that doesn't require explanation, using it as the basis for his supernatural knowledge and his rivalry with the Pines family, but never retroactively explains how a 9-year-old in a small Oregon town came to possess a journal hidden by a paranormal researcher 30 years before. One reading is that the journal simply surfaced naturally over time, found by someone in the town and eventually traded or sold until it reached Gideon. Another reading is that someone gave it to him intentionally, possibly as part of a plan involving Gideon's particular combination of ambition and insufficient wisdom. Bill's hand in this is not confirmed, but his modus operandi of placing useful tools in the hands of susceptible people makes the question worth asking. The journals were thrown into the bottomless pit at the end of the show, all three of them, after Weird Mageddon, after their apparently magical restoration following Bill's defeat. The family decided, collectively, that the knowledge in them was too dangerous to keep around and too important to destroy. That throwing them into the bottomless pit, with its property of sending objects potentially anywhere and anywhen, was the most responsible option available. This is, in its way, the show's most honest statement about knowledge. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do with dangerous information is scatter it so widely that no single person can gather it all together and use it destructively. But the journals are not destroyed. They still exist, somewhere in the show's cosmology, traveling through dimensional space or temporal displacement, or whatever the bottomless pit actually connects to. The knowledge in them is still extant. Somewhere at some point, those three green books with their six-fingered gold covers will come to rest in the hands of someone who will open them and start reading. Who that person is, what era they come from, what dimension they inhabit, whether they will use what they find wisely or dangerously or not at all. These are questions the show leaves floating in the air with the same deliberate openness with which it leaves so many of its other questions. The broader question of how many documents Ford produced during his time in Gravity Falls is also unresolved. 3 journals, numbered and formal, represent his systematic research record. But Ford was in Gravity Falls for years before the portal accident. He was running experiments, building devices, cataloging creatures, designing his lab. He must have produced working notes, drafts, interim findings, experimental records, all the paper and data that accumulates around any sustained research project. What happened to all of that? Was any of it in the bunker, in addition to the more dangerous experiments? Was any of it destroyed by Bill during Weird Mageddon, despite the apparent restoration of the journals themselves? Is there documentation of Ford's 30-plus years of research that exists somewhere other than the 3 journals, and that has never been found? These questions matter because the journals, comprehensive as they are, represent only a partial record of Ford's knowledge. The man who came back through the portal after 30 years of interdimensional experience had accumulated an understanding of the supernatural that went far beyond what he had written down before he disappeared. That understanding, largely unrecorded, left with Ford when he and Stan sailed away on the Stan War II. Gravity Falls, restored and still weird, is now a town whose most knowledgeable expert has sailed away, taking with him decades of irreplaceable knowledge that exists nowhere else. Section 3. Bill Cipher, Euclidia, the Nightmare Realm, and the Trillion-Year Plan. He appears in the show's mythology before he appears on screen. His image is in the opening credits from the very first episode, visible for a fraction of a second at the end of the theme song. A yellow triangle, one-eyed, top-hatted, at the center of a wheel covered in symbols. He is on the rug in the Mystery Shack's main room. He is in the triangular window in the attic. He is drawn in cave paintings that have been there for centuries. He is referenced in Journal 2, which Gideon possesses, in a section that describes how to summon him. He is in Journal 3 in a section that describes how to stop him if you're foolish enough to summon him. He is everywhere in Gravity Falls before he ever actually speaks, and this ubiquity is the first thing to understand about Bill Cipher. He has been here for a very long time, and everywhere he has been, he has left his mark. His name, when he finally introduces himself in the season 1 episode Dreamscapers, is delivered with the particular theatricality of a being who has given a great deal of thought to the impression they make on others. But it is not his real name. He has explained this himself in various appearances, including an AMA he conducted in character during the show's original run. His actual name is one that would cause a human being to experience simultaneous horror and ecstasy severe enough to destroy them. Bill Cipher is the name he uses for convenience, for dealings with mortals who could not survive the truth of what they are actually addressing. The alias is itself a form of mercy, or at least a simulation of mercy, performed by a being who is not particularly known for the genuine article. He is ancient. The show is not coy about this. Bill Cipher is described as being over 1 trillion years old, a number so large that it becomes meaningless in the way that very large numbers always become meaningless when applied to individual experience. 1 trillion years. The universe as we understand it is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Bill predates our universe's current form by a factor of roughly 70. He has existed, conscious and active and bored and scheming, for a span of time that makes the entire history of human civilization a rounding error. He has watched civilizations rise and collapse in the time it takes a human to notice that the light in a room has changed. He has had plans running simultaneously across spans of time that would require multiple human lifetimes simply to comprehend, let alone execute. He came from Euclidia, the second dimension, a flat universe, two-dimensional, inhabited by beings whose entire experience of reality was planar and contained. The show describes this world in terms that Bill himself provides, which means the description carries the caveats that always come with information delivered by a being constitutionally incapable of complete honesty. Flat minds and flat ideas, he says of his home. A place without depth, or richness, or possibility. A prison disguised as a world. He says this with contempt, and the contempt tells you something. He did not find Euclidia dull because it was objectively limited. He found it dull because he was exceptional within it in a way that nothing in it could accommodate. He was born with the ability to perceive the third dimension, to see depth in a world that had none, and this ability made him irreversibly different from everyone around him, and therefore irreversibly lonely in the particular way that only isolation through superiority can make a person. The show's connection to the novel Flatland, written by Edwin Abbott Abbott in 1884, is deliberate and acknowledged. Flatland is a novella narrated by a two-dimensional square who lives in a world of flat beings and gradually comes to perceive a third dimension that his society cannot accept. The parallels to Bill's backstory are explicit enough that Bill himself, during one of his in-character AMAs, cited Abbott's work as having a decent idea about his origin. The difference between Flatland's narrator and Bill Cipher is what matters here. Abbott's square is transformed by perceiving the third dimension in ways that ultimately humanize him, that make him more empathetic, more curious, more open. Bill went in the opposite direction. The perception of the third dimension gave him not empathy but contempt. What he did with that contempt is where his story becomes a tragedy, if you are inclined to read it that way, or a lesson, if you are not. He destroyed Euclidia. He burned the second dimension, unmade it, ended every life in it, including those of his own parents and every being he had ever known. The show presents this, through Bill's own narration, as an act of liberation. He freed his world from its flatness. He elevated it from limitation to nothing, and nothing was, in his telling, a vast improvement. He became, through the act of destruction, something different from what he had been before, not a citizen of a limited world, but a being of unlimited dimensions, able to perceive and traverse realities in ways that no ordinary denizen of any dimension could match. The Book of Bill, published in 2024 and set up as a piece of in-universe text written partly by Bill himself and partly by documents recovered from various sources, complicates this picture significantly. The destruction of Euclidia, according to the expanded lore, was not entirely intentional in the way Bill has always claimed. The fire that consumed his home dimension was at least partly an accident, a consequence of Bill losing control rather than exercising it, of power exceeding containment rather than being deliberately unleashed. The version of events in which Bill chose to destroy his home, in which the destruction was an act of will and therefore a statement about his values and his philosophy, is the version Bill tells himself. The other version, the one implied by the Book of Bill and hinted at by the axolotl poem, is that Bill destroyed his home in a moment of uncontrolled power, was consumed by guilt too enormous to face, and constructed the liberation narrative as a psychological defense against a truth he cannot bring himself to acknowledge. This reading makes Bill significantly more complex than the pure chaos god villain reading the show sometimes invites. A being who destroyed their home accidentally and then spent over 1 trillion years telling themselves it was on purpose, building an entire identity around the deliberate embrace of destruction, because the alternative, accepting that it was an accident, that the world he killed deserved to exist, that his parents deserved to live, was simply too devastating to carry. The axolotl poem, which we will return to at length in a later section, says it directly, says he's happy, he's a liar. The performance of contentment, of satisfaction in chaos, of triumphant indifference to everything is the performance of a being who has been running from grief for longer than our universe has existed. After Euclidia, he migrated to the nightmare realm. This is the dimension that serves as Bill's base of operations throughout the show, the place from which he reaches into the dreams of mortals, the space he is trying to merge with the third dimension through Weirdmageddon. The Nightmare Realm is described as a lawless and unstable crawl space between dimensions, a place without consistent physics or reliable rules, where reality is optional and nothing persists except by force of will. It is, in many ways, exactly the opposite of Euclidia. Not flat but formless, not ordered but chaotic, not limited but limitless in the worst possible sense. Limitless in the way that a void is limitless, without structure or meaning or anything to push against. The nightmare realm is collapsing. This is one of the show's most significant pieces of world building and one of the most underexplored. Bill's entire trillion-year plan, the reason for all the deals and the manipulations and the centuries spent reaching through dimensional walls into the dreams of susceptible mortals, is driven by necessity. The nightmare realm is falling apart. Its inherent instability, the same quality that makes it attractive to a being like Bill who thrives on chaos, is also fatal to it in the long run. The edges of the realm are dissolving. Reality is contracting within it. Bill needs a new home, and the only way to get a new home is to merge his deteriorating dimension with a stable one, overlaying the nightmare realm onto the third dimension and essentially consuming it. Weirdmageddon was not just a passion project. It was a survival strategy on a cosmic scale. This changes the moral calculus of Bill's villainy in subtle but important ways. He was not acting out of pure destructiveness, or at least not only out of pure destructiveness. He was acting out of desperation, the desperation of a being whose current home was literally ceasing to exist. The destruction he planned for the third dimension was real and would have been absolute and is completely indefensible. But the reason behind it was not simple malice. It was the logic of a being facing annihilation, reaching for the only option available to him. There is a piece of Bill's history with the specific location of Gravity Falls that the show establishes but never fully develops. Long before Ford arrived, long before the 19th century settlement by the Northwests and their contemporaries, the indigenous people of the valley knew about Bill. They knew what he was and what he wanted. They developed and maintained a system of containment, a ritual or a set of rituals that kept him sealed away from the third dimension in that specific location. Ford finds the evidence of this in cave paintings, ancient drawings depicting a triangle with one eye above a landscape of fire, the same image that turns up centuries later as a tapestry on the wall of the Northwest Mansion. The warning had been painted into stone by people who understood the warning was necessary. What happened to that knowledge? What happened to the community that maintained the containment? These questions intersect with the actual history of the Pacific Northwest, with the displacement and destruction of indigenous communities by colonization, and the show does not address them directly, but their implications are present in the background of the story. The containment of Bill that the ancient inhabitants of the valley maintained was broken not by any dramatic act of malice, but simply by the erasure of the community and the knowledge that sustained it. Ford arrived in a town that had forgotten, or been made to forget, the nature of what it was built on top of. He walked into a valley whose warning system had been dismantled by history, and he found cave paintings he couldn't read in time. Bill's relationship with Ford is the engine of the show's main plot, and it is also one of the most detailed examples of his operational methodology. He did not approach Ford through intimidation or force. He approached him through flattery and intellectual companionship. Ford was, at the time of their first contact, a brilliant man who felt profoundly isolated, working alone in the woods of Oregon, estranged from his brother, separated by years of silence from the human connection that might have given him perspective on what he was getting into. Bill recognized this isolation and exploited it with extraordinary precision. He presented himself as a peer, as a fellow seeker of understanding, as the one being in Ford's experience who could fully appreciate the scope of his intelligence and the significance of his research. He fed Ford information. He guided his experiments. He shared what felt like genuine insight and genuine friendship. The friendship between Ford and Bill lasted years before Ford found out the truth. And during that time, the evidence of the friendship's influence was visible everywhere in Ford's life. He collected triangular memorabilia, he remodeled the architecture of his house in ways that honored Bill's geometry. He converted his private study into something approaching a place of worship. An intelligent man, a trained scientist with a PhD, and decades of research experience, was being gradually converted into a true believer by a being who had been practicing this particular form of manipulation for longer than civilization. What stopped it was Fiddleford McGucket's accident with the portal. When McGucket was sucked partway into the opening and glimpsed what was on the other side, his horror jolted Ford back toward clarity. Ford confronted Bill. Bill dropped the performance for a moment and showed Ford exactly what had been behind the friendliness all along. The threat was real and direct. Ford shut down the portal, hid the journals, called his brother, and set in motion the accident that sent him into the dimensional void for 30 years. Bill's strategy over those 30 years is worth considering. He was presumably still active during the entire period of Ford's absence. He was making deals with other people in other places. He had arranged things so that the portal would eventually be reactivated, not because Stan was his agent, but because Stan's love for his brother was a reliable enough force to eventually produce the outcome Bill needed. He had read Stan correctly decades before Stan did anything useful for his plans. The patience this represents is the patience of a being who has watched civilizations rise and fall and understands that humans will, given sufficient time and sufficient motivation, do the things that serve their emotional needs regardless of what any external force instructs. Bill did not need to control Stan. He only needed to ensure that Stan wanted his brother back badly enough to do something about it. Everything else followed naturally. Section 4. The Society of the Blind Eye. Forgetting as a strategy and a tragedy. The symbol is an eye with a large X across it. Crossed out, negated. An eye that is chosen not to see. It appears in the show before its source is identified, visible in the background of multiple episodes, as graffiti on walls around Gravity Falls, a tag left behind by the members of a secret organization whenever they have performed a memory erasure on a civilian who witnessed something supernatural. The symbol is the organization's aesthetic statement about itself. We are the eye that does not look. We are the ones who choose on behalf of everyone what will be remembered and what will not. The Society of the Blind Eye was founded in 1982 by Fiddleford Hadron McGucket, and the circumstances of its founding are both more compassionate and more catastrophic than the organization's later history suggests. McGucket had been, before the founding, a man of extraordinary technical ability. A mechanic and inventor of the kind that appears fixed in a generation rarely. Someone who could look at a blueprint and not just understand the design, but immediately see three alternative approaches that would work better. He attended Backup-Smore University in the mid-1970s and encountered Stanford Pines there who recognized in McGucket the kind of practical brilliance that complemented Ford's theoretical genius. When Ford eventually called him to Gravity Falls for the Portal project, McGucket came without hesitation. He came because he trusted Ford. He stayed for years because he was genuinely engaged by the work itself, by the novel technical challenges of building a machine that had never been built before. He contributed substantially to the portal's construction. He was a real partner in the project, not a hired hand. And Ford kept from him, with the particular dishonesty of a person who tells themselves they are protecting someone rather than simply protecting themselves from the difficulty of a hard conversation, the nature of the entity who was guiding their work. McGucket knew Ford had a mysterious collaborator. He did not know the collaborator was a multi-dimensional chaos demon with an agenda that would end badly for everyone in the third dimension. When the portal first ran a test and McGucket was accidentally drawn partway into it, partially inhaled by the machine as the show describes it, he got a glimpse of what was on the other side. The nightmare realm, the collapsing void of lawless unreality that Bill was trying to merge with the world McGucket lived in. McGucket did not have the years of gradual acclimation to the impossible that Ford had used to numb himself to each successive discovery. The glimpse lasted only seconds, and it was enough to break something in him that did not fully mend for over 30 years. He quit the project immediately. He could not articulate what he had seen in ways that made sense to anyone who had not seen it, including himself. He went home. And then, because the images would not leave him and the sleep would not come and the waking hours were saturated with the memory of what he had glimpsed through that crack in reality, he used the memory erasing device he had built during the Portal project, built originally for therapeutic personal use for the removal of specific traumatic memories when needed, and he used it on himself. The first erasure worked. The specific memory of the nightmare realm softened and then dissolved, replaced by a blankness that was uncomfortable but livable. McGucket slept for the first time in days. He woke up feeling almost normal. A few days later, the memory crept back, or something connected to it did. Some atmospheric dread that clung to the edges of the erasure and would not quite release. He used the gun again, and the cycle began. The gun worked by extracting specific memories in physical form as glowing capsules of encapsulated experience, which could then be sent through a pneumatic tube system to a storage room McGucket came to call the Hall of the Forgotten. Each extracted memory was preserved in its capsule, retrievable in principle. But each use of the gun also had side effects. The surrounding neural architecture of the extracted memory was disrupted. Adjacent memories became less stable. The smooth continuity of a person's autobiographical memory developed gaps and inconsistencies. Over time, with repeated use, the damage accumulated from micro scale to macro scale, from minor inconsistencies to significant holes, to eventually the collapse of the entire structure of coherent self-narrative. McGucket used the gun on himself 17 times in the period between quitting Ford's project and founding the Blind Eye Society. This is the number the show gives. 17 uses in a span of days, a rate of self-modification so intense that it began to show externally within weeks. He was losing words. His behavior was becoming less predictable. The brilliant mechanic who had built machines that didn't exist before he built them was losing the ability to maintain a linear train of thought. He was, by any honest assessment, destroying himself in order to not feel something. In those 17 days, he also founded the Blind Eye Society. The founding impulse was genuinely benevolent, at least in the most charitable reading. He wanted to help. He knew that Gravity Falls was a place where ordinary people regularly encountered things that ordinary life gave them no tools to process. He knew this because he was now one of those people, and the thing he had found to help himself was the gun. And he wanted to share that help with others. The society was, in its original conception, a therapeutic service. What it began on was something else. Once McGucket's own mind had deteriorated past the point of effective leadership, and this happened quickly within months of the society's founding, because 17 memory erasures in 17 days is a catastrophic start to any long-term project. The society continued without him. It continued under the direction of other members, eventually falling under the leadership of a man identified in the show as Blind Ivan, who approached the society's mission with considerably more self-interest and considerably less compassion than its founder had. The members of the Blind Eye Society, when Dipper and company finally uncover the organization and expose its current membership, are a cross-section of Gravity Falls' civilian population. Bud Gleeful, Gideon's father. Toby Determined, the local reporter. A man who had married a woodpecker, an outcome the show implies was at least partly a consequence of how many times he had erased his own judgment. They are not, for the most part, evil people in any straightforward sense. They are people who got in over their heads and found a convenient way to pretend they hadn't, and then found themselves locked into that pretense by the organization that had helped them achieve it. The irony is profound, and the show does not blink at it. The organization dedicated to the erasure of uncomfortable knowledge had, through the mechanism of its own primary tool, erased enough of its own founding history that its current leader had no memory of the society's original purpose or its founder. Blind Ivan had completely forgotten that the Blind Eye Society had been founded by McGucket. The gun had been used so many times by so many members on so many targets that the institutional memory of the organization had been reduced to procedure without context, ritual without meaning. The defeat of the Blind Eye Society in Season 2 does not fully resolve what the society represents. The organization is disbanded. Most of its members have their memories of the society itself erased. But the Hall of the Forgotten is still there. As far as the show tells us, it still exists beneath the Gravity Falls Museum of History, accessible through the fireplace in the eye exhibit, full of glass capsules containing the extracted supernatural memories of decades of Gravity Falls residents. The show acknowledges in Gravity Falls Lost Legends that at least one society member escaped the final confrontation without having their memory erased, and that this member was later found operating at a paranormal black market called the Crawl Space, selling memory tubes. The collected memories of Gravity Falls, 50 years of supernatural experiences carefully extracted and stored in glass capsules in the Hall of the Forgotten, are still somewhere. If those capsules were played back for the people they were taken from, the town's entire collective understanding of itself would be permanently changed. The comfortable amnesia the society enforced for decades would collapse all at once. What would Gravity Falls be if its residents remembered everything they had ever seen and been made to forget? There is a moment in the Society of the Blind Eye episode that deserves extended attention. When the members are about to erase the memories of Dipper and the others, each character makes a confession under pressure. Suze admits he thought Mabel's name was Maple for a long time. Mabel confesses she doesn't actually love all her stuffed animals equally. Dipper admits he uses big words he doesn't fully understand because it makes people think he's smart. Wendy admits that her whole laid-back persona is a performance, that she is stressed out all the time and that nothing in her life is about as easy as she makes it look. These confessions, extracted by threat of erasure, are the most honest moments any of these characters have in the episode, and they happen precisely because the threat of forgetting makes honesty suddenly urgent. If you might not remember who you are tomorrow, you might as well be truthful about who you are today. The lesson of the Society of the Blind Eye is one that Gravity Falls makes quietly and without editorializing. The willingness to not see is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. It makes you complicit in the things you chose to look away from. And in a town built on the premise of hidden truths, the question of what you allow yourself to know and what you allow to be taken from you is not abstract. Section 5, The Pines Family. Glass Shard Beach, 30 years of guilt, and a portal in the basement. Stanley and Stanford Pines were born twins and Mashine twins in Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, at some point in the 1950s to parents named Philbrick and Ma Pines. The family was not wealthy, the town was not prosperous. The name Glass Shard Beach is the kind of name that tells you everything you need to know about the quality of the beach, and the quality of the beach is a reasonable proxy for the quality of the available opportunities. The boys grew up with the understanding, imparted in various ways both explicit and atmospheric, that the world had not reserved anything particularly good for them, and that if they wanted something, they would have to take it. What distinguished them from each other from an early age was this. Stanford had 6 fingers on each hand, and this physical difference became in the Pines household a symbol of exception. Ford was the exceptional one, the one with the extra fingers and the apparently extraordinary intellect to match. Stan was the other one, the one who had to make his way through the world on charm and street smarts, and the particular kind of intelligence that doesn't translate to academic success, but is invaluable in situations where you need to talk your way out of something. They were close the way twins can be close, with the intimacy of people who have literally never known a world that didn't include the other. And they dreamed together of escaping Glass Shard Beach and making something of themselves on the open ocean. They built a boat called the Stan-O War. They planned voyages. The fracture between them happened at the worst possible moment and through the most mundane possible mechanism. Ford's science project, a perpetual motion machine he had been building in preparation for a scholarship competition that would have been his ticket out of Glass Shard Beach, was damaged. Stan was tinkering with it. The damage looked like deliberate sabotage, or at least Ford believed it was, and Philbrick Pines believed it was, and that belief was sufficient. The scholarship fell through. Ford's path was derailed. Stan was expelled from the family home on the spot, disowned with a coldness that suggests the fracture between father and son had been there, waiting for a long time, and this was merely the moment that made it official. The years that followed were, for both brothers, defined by what had broken. Ford went to college, eventually to a PhD program, eventually to a research grant, eventually to Gravity Falls. The exceptional twin finding the exceptional career, building toward an exceptional future, but alone, profoundly alone, in the way that people who leave everything behind to pursue their own exceptionality tend to be alone. Stan wandered. He ran cons. He was arrested in multiple states, banned from others, and at various points imprisoned in 3 separate countries, which, given the number of countries that would require, makes his international reach, if nothing else. Their reconciliation, or the closest thing to it, came through a postcard. Ford, deep in his collaboration with Bill, deep in the slow awakening to the possibility that his collaborator was not what he had claimed to be, wrote to Stanley. The postcard was not a reconciliation. It was not an apology or even a thawing. It was a request. Come to Gravity Falls, take one of my journals, go as far away as possible with it. Stanley received the postcard as the first communication from his brother in years, and he came. What happened when he got there set the course of both their lives for the next 30 years. The show depicts the night of the portal accident in a flashback during A Tale of Two Stans, and it is one of the most emotionally precise sequences in the series. The brothers arguing, old wounds reopened, Ford wanting Stanley to simply do as he was asked, to take the journal and go without explanation, without the conversation they had never had about what happened in that basement years ago. Stanley wanting something more, wanting acknowledgement, wanting the thing that 10 years of estrangement had left unaddressed between them. They fought. They knocked the portal controls. Ford stumbled in. He was gone. Stan stood in the lab alone. His brother was gone through a machine that neither of them fully understood. There was no one to call, no authority to inform, no protocol for this. There was just Stan, standing in a basement mine labyrinth full of incomprehensible technology, in a house in the woods in Oregon that was now technically his, with no obvious path forward, and one journal that contained, somewhere in its pages, information about how the machine that had just taken his brother worked. He spent 30 years figuring it out. The show's most remarkable piece of character revelation is the unveiling of what Stan's entire adult life turned out to have been. A project. The Mystery Shack was a front. The tourist dollars a funding mechanism. The Grunkle Stan persona a cover for a man who had decided, at some point in those early years after the accident, that the only thing his life was going to be used for was bringing his brother back. Every year, every season, every dollar from every gullible tourist, every piece of radioactive waste he collected, every component he rebuilt from scratch using the journals as guides, every interaction with the federal agents investigating his apparently illegal operation. All of it was in service of one thing. It is worth sitting with the scale of this. 30 years. Stan was not young when this started. He was not a man with a future full of options, deciding to spend a few years on a project before moving on. He was a man with no prospects who made a decision about the shape of his remaining life, and then held to it through 3 decades of solitary labor with no guarantee of success and no external validation that what he was doing was possible. He never told anyone. He had no one to tell. He was alone with the machine and the journals and the fact of his brother's disappearance and the particular kind of stubbornness that is the only version of faith available to people who don't have any other kind. The question of what Stan experienced during those 30 years beyond the practical work of the Portal Project is one the show gestures at without fully exploring. He was, functionally, not himself for the entire period. He was living under his brother's name. He was performing a character, Grunkle Stan, the cynical tourist trap operator, that had just enough surface overlap with his actual personality to be sustainable but was also clearly a persona rather than a person. What did that do to him? What does it mean to spend 30 years being someone else's name while doing work that has no audience and no validation? The show's depiction of Stan suggests a person who has sublimated virtually all personal need into the project, who has made the project the entire emotional content of his existence, and who will not know what to do with himself once it is complete. The resolution between Stan and Ford, when it finally comes, is not a grand speech or a formal ceremony. It is a shared crisis, the irreversible urgency of Weirdmageddon pressing them into cooperation before they have managed to fully process their 30 years of separation and mutual guilt. The final sacrifice Stan makes, allowing Bill into his mind, allowing his memories to be erased, along with the demon inside them, is the most definitive possible statement of love from a man who spent his entire adult life unable to say it directly. He gives everything for his brother in the most literal sense. He gives himself. Stan recovers his memory through Mabel's scrapbook. Whether the recovery is complete is a question the show handles with deliberate gentleness. He seems whole at the end. He has his personality, his humor, his particular brand of gruff affection. But the process of memory recovery through an external record is necessarily different from the persistence of lived memory. What he gets back is the shape of who he was, reconstructed from evidence. Whether the internal experience of that reconstruction matches the internal experience of the original is not something any external observer can confirm, and the show does not pretend otherwise. There are other questions about the brothers' post-show lives that remain beautifully unanswered. The Stanowar 2, the ship named after the one they built as children, represents the fulfillment of the dream they shared before everything went wrong. The post-credits scene of the finale shows them fighting something large and strange in rough waters, Ford in a submarine suit and Stan in a boxing stance. What their relationship actually became, whether the old resentments faded, or whether they had better and harder conversations at sea than they ever had in that basement, we will never know for certain. But the image of those two old men fighting things together, in the ocean, heading toward the horizon, that is the image the show chooses to leave with us. And it is exactly right. Section 6, the cipher wheel, the prophecy, the people, and why it didn't work. In the opening theme of Gravity Falls, after the montage of supernatural imagery and before the show's title appears, there's a single frame lasting less than a second. It is easy to miss. At normal viewing speed, it is essentially invisible without deliberate effort. The frame shows a circular wheel divided into 10 segments. Each segment contains a symbol. And at the center of the wheel, inside all the symbols, is a triangle with one eye. The wheel has been there since the first episode, before anyone knows what it means. Before the show has even introduced the characters whose symbols appear on it. It is a promise and a map and a question delivered simultaneously, planted at the very beginning, so that when it eventually becomes relevant, everything clicks into place with the satisfying precision of something that was always going to be there. The wheel is called the Bill Cipher Zodiac, or simply the Cipher Wheel, and the show builds toward it across 2 entire seasons before deploying it in the finale in a way that is simultaneously the most expected and most unexpected thing it could possibly do. The expected part: the wheel is used in the final confrontation with Bill in an attempt to defeat him. The unexpected part: the attempt fails. The wheel doesn't work. The prophesied method of defeating the most powerful entity in the show's universe falls apart at the critical moment, and the actual defeat comes through an entirely different mechanism that no prophecy predicted. The symbols on the wheel correspond to specific people. 10 individuals, each represented by an image associated with them. Mabel's shooting star, which appears on the shooting star sweater she often wears. Dipper's pine tree, which echoes his family name. Stan's crescent moon, connected to the shape on his fez. Ford's 6 fingers, his most identifying physical characteristic. Seuss's question mark, connected to his essential character as a person full of curiosity. Old Man McGucket's spectacles, marking him as the scholar despite his current deteriorated state. Wendy's ice bag, referencing a personal characteristic the show leaves somewhat unexplained. Robbie's sewn together heart, suggesting both his musical persona and something darker. Gideon's star with an eye, reflecting his psychic themed persona and his genuine connection to the supernatural forces. And Pacifica's lightning bolt, suggesting both the power of her eventual choices and the electricity of her family's corrupted legacy. The wheel also appears, long before the finale, as a tapestry in the Northwest Mansion. The tapestry depicts Bill floating above a burning landscape with figures bowing at the bottom. It has been on that wall for generations, predating the current Northwest family members. Someone knew this image long before Ford spray painted it on the floor of Bill's temple. Someone put it on a wall and let it hang there for 150 years. Who that was and what they knew is a question the show raises and then steps back from. Ford describes the wheel to the assembled group in the finale's climax as a means of defeating Bill. 10 specific individuals gathering in a circle and joining hands, their combined symbolic resonance creating something powerful enough to contain or destroy him. The image was described, as Ford explains it, in documents connected to the prophecy about Bill's relationship with the town. Ford spray paints the wheel on the floor. He calls the 10 people, they take their positions. And then Stan says something sharp to Ford. Old resentments break through the urgency. The moment of petty brother anger that has been building since their reunion cracks open at exactly the wrong time. Ford says something back. Their hands break apart. The circuit is incomplete. Bill destroys the painted wheel and captures both brothers. This is, on its face, the most human possible way for an apocalyptic prophecy to fail. Alex Hirsch has confirmed that this was always the plan. The wheel was never going to work. The story was always going to be resolved through the family rather than through the prophecy. The wheel was more symbolic than literal, a representation of the interconnectedness of all the characters around whom the summer's events rotated, not a literal magical circuit. But this confirmation leaves questions about the prophecy itself that are interesting to sit with. If the wheel was never going to work, what was the original intent behind its creation? The ancient protectors of the valley who designed it presumably believed it would work. Were they wrong? Did they create a mechanism that seemed sound but had a fatal design flaw? Its dependence on human cooperation, which is always the least reliable element of any plan? There is a theory in the fan community that the wheel's failure was itself predicted, that the ancient design included within it the knowledge that the wheel would not be the actual mechanism of defeat, but that the attempt to use the wheel would create the conditions for the actual mechanism to emerge. In other words, the wheel was always meant to fail, and its failure was the thing that forced the characters toward the solution that actually worked. The question of why those 10 specific people was chosen also deserves consideration. Some connections are obvious, others are less clear. Robbie Valentino, in particular, the teenage musician with the animated tattoos, has a connection to the wheel that the show never explicitly explains. There are hints scattered in the episodes involving his music that suggest a supernatural origin for certain aspects of his performance abilities, possibly connected to a deal with an entity in Bill's network. Whether this is the reason for his symbol on the wheel, or whether his inclusion is connected to something the show never had time to address, is unknown. The show gives us Robbie on the wheel and provides no explanation for why he belongs there. It is one of the many small questions that the 40-episode format could not accommodate. The cipher wheel is the show's central symbol, the image it gave us at the very beginning and built everything around. Its incomplete resolution is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is a feature of it. The wheel that was supposed to save the world didn't save the world. The world was saved by something the wheel couldn't have predicted. Stan Pines, realizing that the only thing he had ever been good for was this moment, one act of genuine selfless love, offered freely and without reservation in the burning ruins of a triangle's dream. Section 7. Weird Mageddon. What the apocalypse actually was and why a snow globe stopped it. The apocalypse began with a deal. More specifically, it began with the exploitation of a 12-year-old girl's grief at a vulnerable moment, which is a description of something that the show presents unflinchingly and refuses to soften. Mabel Pines had just learned that Dipper had been offered an apprenticeship with Ford, that his plan was to stay in Gravity Falls while she went home to California, that the summer she had been living was going to end in a way that permanently restructured the world she had built within it. She was 12. She was sad in the way that 12-year-olds are sad when something they love is ending, with complete conviction that the sadness is permanent and the loss is absolute. She had no distance on it. She had no perspective. She had only the immediate fact of a future she hadn't chosen and couldn't fix. Bill Cipher, possessing the body of Blendon Blandon, offered her a solution. Not a complicated one. Not a sophisticated one. A simple, child-scaled offer he could make summer last forever. She could have all of it, all of the Mystery Shack and Waddles and Wendy and Sue's, and the strange, beautiful, broken life she had been living. And she would never have to give it up. All she had to do was give him a small glass vial she had taken by accident, something she barely understood, something she had no way to know was the most dangerous object in the show's universe. She gave it to him. The interdimensional rift, the destabilized remnant of reality created by Stan's portal activation, was released. Bill stepped into the physical world. The sky tore. The pyramid rose. Weird Mageddon began. The mechanics of Weird Mageddon are worth understanding in detail because they reveal something important about both Bill's power and his limits. When Bill enters the third dimension in physical form, he is not invulnerable. He is extraordinarily powerful. He can alter reality within his range, convert matter, reshape geography, petrify living beings, and command the various nightmare creatures he brought through with him. But he is constrained by the specific properties of the location he has entered. Gravity Falls has a barrier. The valley, shaped by the ancient spacecraft crash into a natural funnel geometry, has properties that Ford understood and encoded into a mathematical equation that he built into the town's dimensional architecture. The barrier prevents Bill from leaving the valley. The apocalypse he planned for the world is stalled at the town limits. This is one of the show's most interesting structural choices. Bill wins Gravity Falls completely. He transforms it without apparent effort into a landscape of nightmare. His pyramid rising over everything, the normal physics of the town replaced by his own rules. The citizens either fled, hidden, or petrified and incorporated into his throne. He is, within Gravity Falls, as close to omnipotent as makes no practical difference. And he cannot leave. The most powerful entity in the show's universe is contained by a valley in Oregon, trapped in a snow globe of his own making, his grand design for universal chaos stuck at the population of a small town. Ford put that barrier there. It was the equation. The specific mathematical formula describing the properties of the dimensional barrier around the town. Ford encoded it into the valley's geometry and carried the full solution only in his own memory, making himself the only person who could undo it. Bill knew this. He needed that equation. The entire third part of Weird Mageddon is about Bill trying to get it from Ford. First through offers of power and glory, which Ford declines, then through direct torture, which Ford endures without breaking, then through the failed attempt to enter Ford's mind directly to take it without consent, which runs into the rule of the mindscape that Bill cannot enter a conscious mind without an invitation. The mindscape rule is one of the show's most important pieces of internal logic. Bill is, in many ways, is the most powerful being in the show's universe, but his power has a specific constraint. He cannot take, he can only receive. In the mindscape, access requires consent. He can terrorize someone's dreams, can invade their sleep, can put pressure on their unconscious thoughts. But to enter a waking mind, to access the specific memories and knowledge of a conscious person, he needs them to agree. He needs them to shake his hand literally and let him in. This rule is what the Pines brothers exploit in the finale. Ford apparently agrees to let Bill access his mind. Bill enters. The mind he enters is Stan's. The twins have switched clothes. Bill, in his giddiness at finally getting what he needs, does not read the thoughts carefully enough to notice the switch before it is too late. Ford, outside the mindscape, uses the memory gun. Stan's mind, with Bill inside it, begins to be erased. Bill realizes the trap. He tries to bargain. He offers Stan everything: money, fame, his own galaxy, riches beyond comprehension. Stan is not interested. He has known for 30 years what his life was worth, and the answer was always his family, not anything Bill could offer. Stan reminds Bill, as the blue flames consume the mindscape, that he made one mistake. He messed with the wrong family. And then Stan punches the destabilized form of Bill's cipher in his eye, shattering the demon into pieces as his own memories dissolve around him. It is the most mundane possible victory over a trillion-year-old interdimensional chaos god. And it is exactly right. Following Bill's erasure, Weirdmageddon reverses entirely. The petrified citizens are freed. The nightmare creatures are drawn back through the closing rift. The pyramid collapses, Gravity Falls reassembles itself. The only physical remnant of the event is Bill's petrified body, somewhere in the forest outside town. A stone triangle with a top hat, half buried in the ground, left behind like a very alarming piece of abstract sculpture in the Oregon woods. But Bill's final words, when played backwards, say something that the show refuses to treat as settled. IXOLOTL, my time has come to burn. I invoke the ancient power that I may return. The axolotl is a being described in supplementary canonical material as existing at a power level that dwarfs even Bill Cipher and Time Baby, a cosmic entity operating on a framework of reality that exceeds anything the show directly depicts. Bill's invocation of it, at the moment of his apparent destruction, is not casual. It is a prayer. It is a last-ditch attempt at salvation from the one being that they, in the show's universe, powerful enough to grant it. The poem about Bill that the axolotl delivers, 60 degrees that come in threes, watches from within birch trees, saw his own dimension burn, misses home and can't return, says he's happy, he's a liar, blame the arson for the fire. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. One way to absolve his crime, a different form, a different time, contains within it the answer to the question of whether Bill survived his defeat. The final two lines suggest an explicit path. If Bill invokes the axolotl's name, there is a way for him to return, in a different form, at a different time, having absolved the crime of destroying his home. He invoked the name. The poem says there is a way. Whether the way was granted, whether Bill exists somewhere in the show's universe right now in some form we would not recognize as him, is left entirely open. Alex Hirsch has said in various interviews since the finale that Bill's story is not necessarily finished. He has described the axolotl as operating on a different moral framework than humans understand, in a way that implies neither simple punishment nor simple redemption. He has declined to confirm whether Bill has returned or will return, or what that return would look like. The ambiguity is deliberate. and it is permanent, in the sense that no official continuation of the show has been announced, as of any information available here. And the question remains exactly as open as the show's creators intended it to be. What Weird Mageddon was, at its deepest level, is the culmination of everything Bill had been working toward, for not just the show's 2 seasons, but for the entire span of his trillion-year existence. It was his last attempt at a home. The Nightmare Realm was dying. He needed a dimension he could inhabit permanently. The merger of the Nightmare Realm with the third dimension was not metaphorical. It was literally the transfer of his home territory into a new and more stable host. And beneath that practical desperation was the older, deeper thing: the loss of Euclidia, the home he destroyed and could not return to, the grief he spent a trillion years converting into philosophy and policy and the performance of not caring. He wanted, at the bottom of all of it, to stop running, to have somewhere to be, to go home. The tragedy is that the only home he knew how to build was made of other people's suffering. And in the end, the people who stopped him were a family who knew exactly what it meant to be separated from where they belonged and chose each other over the distance anyway. Section 8. What happened after? The fates of everyone the show left behind. The town restored itself. That is the show's first grace. When Bill was erased from Stan's mind and the Dream Demon's presence dissolved, the effects of Weird Mageddon began to reverse. The petrified people were freed from the stone forms Bill had imposed on them. The twisted geography of the town, reshaped by Bill's aesthetic preferences into something nightmarish, resolved back into the familiar streets and buildings of ordinary Gravity Falls. The tear in the sky where the Nightmare Realm had pressed through sealed over, the pyramid's black stone structure crumbling and collapsing as the power that held it dissolved. The nightmare creatures Bill had brought through were drawn back, sucked into the closing rift with no choice in the matter. The only thing that remained of Weird Mageddon was Bill's petrified physical body somewhere in the forest outside town. The stone form of the entity that had almost ended the third dimension, left behind like a very alarming piece of abstract sculpture in the Oregon woods. The show's ending credits contain a brief post-credit shot of this statue, half buried in the ground, rendered in a grainy handheld camera style that is a deliberate echo of found footage horror aesthetics. It was not just a visual joke, it was a clue. Alex Hirsch subsequently launched a real-world scavenger hunt, the Cipher Hunt, to find an actual Bill Cipher statue that had been hidden in Oregon. The hunt succeeded. The statue eventually came to rest at Confusion Hill, the real roadside attraction that inspired the Mystery Shack's design. But the stone body is canon. Within the show's universe, Bill's petrified form is out there in the Gravity Falls forest, and it represents an unresolved question. Is the stone body simply inert, a remnant, a monument to defeat? Or does it contain something? The conditions that petrified it were the conditions of Bill's defeat, and those conditions no longer exist. The body remains, and Bill's final invocation of the axolotl suggests a consciousness that was still present and still planning even at the moment of apparent destruction. The Northwest family lost everything. Preston Northwest, whose investment strategy apparently included something called Weirdness Bonds, a financial instrument created by Bill himself as part of the administrative structure of his new order, found himself completely ruined when Weird Mageddon ended and the bonds became worthless. The mansion had to be sold. The family who had defined themselves entirely by their exclusivity and their wealth found themselves without the material basis for either. Pacifica is last seen in the finale at the town's celebration of Bill's defeat, watching her parents deal with the consequences of their choices, looking like someone who has come through an extremely formative experience with her core self somewhat more intact than when she went in. What happened to Pacifica after the summer is one of the more genuinely interesting loose threads. Her arc across season 2 represents perhaps the show's most complete secondary character development. She began as a flat antagonist defined by her wealth and her family's pretensions, and ended as a genuinely three-dimensional person who had confronted her family's history, stood up to her parents, and demonstrated a form of courage that cost her something real. The question of who she is afterward, when the wealth and the mansion are gone and the summer visitors have left, and she has to navigate ordinary Gravity Falls life as a Northwest without the material foundations of what that name meant, is a story the show doesn't tell. Wendy Corduroy's post-summer life is another hanging thread. She was 16 during the summer of the show. She lives in Gravity Falls full-time. She is the descendant of Archibald Corduroy, the lumberjack whose ghost haunted the Northwest Mansion for 150 years. Her family has roots in the town going back to its foundation, which means, in practice, going back to its founding fraud, since the Corduroys were among the laborers exploited by the Northwests from the town's earliest days. What does growing up in Gravity Falls mean for someone who can't leave at the end of summer? What is Wendy Corduroy's life like in the years after Weird Mageddon in a town that collectively decided not to remember the week everything broke? There is also the question of Wendy's specific relationship to the town's supernatural nature. Over the course of the show, she demonstrates a specific kind of competence with supernatural situations that reads as more than just teenage cool. She is genuinely capable, genuinely effective, and genuinely unruffled in ways that suggest a deeper acclimation to the strange than most people have. The question of whether this is simply who Wendy is, or whether it is connected to the Corduroy family's longer relationship with the valley's weirdness, is never addressed. Sos Ramirez inherits the Mystery Shack, which is one of those outcomes the show earned through consistent characterization across 2 seasons. His love for the shack and for the Pines family had been established in episode after episode, and Stan naming him the new manager before sailing away feels both inevitable and exactly right. Sos knows the shack better than anyone. He loves it genuinely, not as a business or an asset, but as a home. As the place that has been his primary relationship with meaning and belonging since before Dipper and Mabel arrived. The flash-forward glimpse the finale provides shows him running the shack successfully with his girlfriend Melody, which is precisely the resolution his arc deserved. But Seuss managing the Mystery Shack is not the same thing as Seuss protecting Gravity Falls. The shack's unique properties, its unicorn hair and mercury and moonstone reinforcements, its status as a building protected from supernatural influence, made it a refuge during Weird Mageddon. Those properties presumably still exist, but Seuss's ability to actively investigate, document, and respond to the ongoing supernatural activity of the town is limited by the fact that he is not a paranormal researcher. He is a good, kind, competent man whose relationship with the supernatural has been defined throughout the show by enthusiastic participation in crises rather than systematic understanding of them. Ford and Stan sailed away. This is the finale's most important decision for the show's mythology. The two people who between them understood Gravity Falls most deeply chose to leave. They did this for the right reasons, for each other, for the dream they had shared before everything went wrong. The choice is emotionally and thematically correct, but its practical consequences for the town are significant. Gravity Falls, restored and still weird. Its dimensional barriers still thin, its forests still full of creatures and anomalies, is now being managed by a man who loves it but cannot systematically study it, with its two most knowledgeable former residents sailing in international waters looking for new adventures. Whether this matters depends on how you think about the town's future. If Gravity Falls is simply a place that has always been weird and will continue to be weird, and has managed to coexist with its own weirdness without catastrophe most of the time, then the departure of Ford and Stan is a loss of expertise but not a crisis. If Gravity Falls is a place that is specifically vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation Bill employed, if the thin dimensional barriers make it perpetually attractive to entities who want what Bill wanted, then the departure of the town's most experienced defenders is a more serious matter. What became of Dipper and Mabel themselves in the years after the summer is a question the show handles with deliberate open-endedness. They return to Piedmont, California. The note Wendy gives Dipper contains the signatures of everyone they spent the summer with, and the words, "See you next summer," a promise and a mystery simultaneously. The show never made a third season. Alex Hirsch made the decision to end at exactly the point he had always intended, resisting pressure to continue indefinitely. He said in an interview that he had always designed Gravity Falls to be a finite series, a story about one epic summer with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That decision is admirable. It is also the source of every unanswered question we are going to spend the rest of this script sitting with. What does Dipper look like at 15, 16, 18? Does he pursue Ford's kind of research? Does the summer in Gravity Falls become the defining experience of his adolescence, something he measures everything else against? Does Mabel keep in touch with Candy and Grenda and Pacifica? Does she and Dipper come back the following summer, and what do they find if they do? The Pines family is intact. The town is restored. See you next summer is written on a piece of paper. Whether next summer ever comes, within the show's universe, is left floating in the Oregon air with everything else. Section 9, the codes, the ciphers, and the show that talked to its own audience. Before we talk about what the codes said, let's talk about what it means that they existed at all. Every single episode of Gravity Falls contained a cryptogram in the end credits. Not hidden anywhere in the episode itself, though the show had those too, extensively, but right there in the closing credits, visible to anyone watching. A string of letters different from standard text sitting in the credits alongside the names of the production crew. The letters were encoded. They required a cipher to decode. And for the full run of the show, they carried messages that were sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes warning, sometimes threatening, and sometimes directly addressed to the viewer in ways that broke the fourth wall in the most unsettling possible manner. The first 6 episodes of the show use the Caesar cipher, named for Julius Caesar, who is historically credited with using a letter shift of 3 to encode private communications. In the version Gravity Falls employed, each letter in the cryptogram was the letter 3 positions earlier in the standard alphabet. D in the cryptogram meant A in the original message, E meant B, and so on. The process of decoding required only patience and a knowledge of the alphabet, which meant that any viewer who noticed the credits text and was motivated to figure it out could do so within minutes using nothing more than a piece of paper. The show was not trying to make the first cipher difficult. It was trying to make decoding feel achievable to establish the practice before escalating the complexity. The first decoded message from the very first episode read, "Stan is not what he seems." 4 words. Delivered in the credits of a show that had just introduced Stan as an apparently uncomplicated con man running a tourist trap. 4 words that were both an accurate factual statement about the most important mystery in the show's first season and a direct instruction to the viewer about how to watch. This show is going to tell you things in the credits that it is not telling you on screen. Pay attention. There's more going on here than what you can see in the main broadcast. The transition between cipher systems was itself announced in the credits. At the end of episode 6, the decoded credit message read, Mr. Caesarian will be out next week. Mr. Atbash will substitute. This is the show winking, acknowledging the game while continuing to play it. Atbash, the cipher that replaced the Caesar cipher for episodes 7 through 13, works by reversing the alphabet. A becomes Z, B becomes Y, C becomes X, and so on. The whole alphabet mirrors itself. It is more complex than a simple shift, requiring either a memorized reversed alphabet or a written substitution table, but still solvable by a motivated viewer without specialized knowledge. Episodes 14 through 19 used A1Z26, the straightforward substitution of letters for their numerical positions in the alphabet. A equals 1. Z equals 26. The credits became strings of numbers rather than strings of letters, a visual signal so obvious that a viewer who had been following the cipher progression could not miss it. Episode 20, the season 1 finale, used a combined cipher requiring multiple decoding steps applied in sequence. First A1Z26, then Atbash, then a final Caesar shift. This is significantly more complex than anything that preceded it, and was the show escalating toward the difficulty level of the second season. Season 2 introduced the Visionaire cipher, and with it a structural change that transformed the relationship between the show and its decoder community. The Visionaire cipher is polyalphabetic, meaning that the same letter in the original message can be encoded as different letters in the cryptogram depending on its position. The encoding shifts for each letter according to a keyword, with each letter of the keyword corresponding to a specific shift amount. This makes it impossible to decode by frequency analysis or simple trial and error letter substitution, because the encoding is not consistent enough for either approach to work. The crucial feature of the Visionaire as used in Gravity Falls is that the keyword is different for each episode and is hidden somewhere within the episode itself, not in a consistently predictable location. Somewhere on a chalkboard in the background of a scene, painted on a wall, written on an object that appears briefly in a character's hand, legible for only a few seconds before the camera moves on. Finding the keyword required watching each episode not just for its narrative content, but as a visual object, scanning backgrounds and props and text elements, with the specific intent of locating a string of letters that might be the key. This transformed the decoder community from individual solvers working in parallel into a collective project, with fans coordinating to cover more ground and share discoveries across forums and discussion boards. A viewer watching alone might never find the keyword in one viewing. A community watching together with hundreds of eyes reviewing every frame would find it within hours. The show had gamified its own watching in a way that required and rewarded community. The keyword shed for the episode Into the Bunker. The keyword Wanch for Society of the Blind Eye. The keyword Pines for A Tale of Two Stands. The keyword Dipper for an episode centering on Dipper's development. The keywords were always meaningful, always connected to the episode's themes, always themselves a layer of the meaning rather than simply a technical necessity. Finding the keyword was not just a puzzle. It was an act of attention to the episode's subject matter that deepened the engagement with it. The messages encoded in the Visionaire ciphers were often the show's most emotionally loaded. Several times the decoded messages were written in Bill's first person, addressing the audience directly. He would acknowledge the viewer. He would comment on the events of the episode. He would taunt. He would warn in ways that sounded more like gloating than warning. In one message, he essentially told the viewers that everything was going according to plan, and there was nothing they could do about it. He addressed them as if they were characters in his story, which, within the show's logic, they effectively were. People who knew the events of the show without being able to intervene in them. Observers of a catastrophe they could watch, but not prevent. The fourth wall quality of these messages is something the show never addressed within its narrative. Bill is aware of the audience. Bill addresses the audience. This is either a quirk of his omniscient adjacent power level. A being who can perceive across dimensions might well be able to perceive the viewers as well as the characters. Or it is a purely meta-textual choice by the creators that exists outside the show's internal logic. The show itself does not decide which reading is correct. It simply lets Bill talk to you and leaves the question of what that means for the nature of the show's universe comfortably unresolved. Beyond the end credits cryptograms, the show placed hidden codes in episode backgrounds, in prop text, in dialogue spoken backward, and in the content of the journals and other written materials that appeared on screen. The reversed whispers at the end of the theme song changed as the cipher system changed, with each shift signaled in the whisper if you played it backward. 3 letters back for the Caesar cipher period. Switch A with Z for the @bash period. 26 letters for the A1Z 26 period. The show embedded its own decoder ring instructions in the sound of itself, in a place where most viewers would never find them. The tie-in website, themysteryofgravityfalls.com, extended this puzzle architecture into the real internet. The site contained hidden pages accessible through coded URL extensions, each one revealing a piece of information or a joke or an image that connected to the show's deeper lore. The page, whose extension was .map, revealed coordinates in Oregon and the phrase "hidden in plain sight." The page .piracy displayed "You wouldn't download a Mabel in an unusual font," a parody of the famous anti-piracy campaigns of the 2000s that managed to be genuinely funny while also being a piece of the site's aesthetic universe. Between 2016 and 2018, the website displayed a pulsing red message in the corner of the screen that read, "Simply help us." Clicking it led to a fan campaign for an official series DVD box set. The campaign worked. The box set was produced. The complete decoding of every hidden message in every episode, every cryptogram in the credits, every background text, every prop inscription, every coded element in the companion books, has never been fully accomplished. The show was designed to reward indefinite attention, and it has delivered on that design. Nearly a decade after the finale, people are still finding things. This is not accidental. The layers were placed with the specific intention of ensuring that no single viewing, no matter how attentive, and no single analysis, no matter how comprehensive, would ever exhaust the available material. This is, in the most honest sense, the show's deepest gift. It trained an audience to look more carefully at the world than they had been looking before, to notice the background, to read what was written small, to ask why something is there that doesn't need to be there, to understand that what a story tells you directly is never all of what the story contains. The habit of attention that Gravity Falls cultivated in the people who watched it carefully is not a habit that applies only to animated television. It applies to everything. It is the show's most enduring contribution to the people who received it. Section 10. The Bunker, the Shapeshifter, Dipper's real name, and the experiments we never saw. In the second season episode Into the Bunker, Dipper discovers a facility hidden in the woods near the Mystery Shack. The entrance is concealed by a combination of camouflage and a lock mechanism of Ford's design, requiring a specific 6-fingered key impression to open. The facility beneath is extensive. Multiple chambers, storage areas, a laboratory space with considerably more sophisticated equipment than anything visible in the Mystery Shack's basement, and at the center of the whole complex, a section of cryogenic storage tubes whose contents are not immediately apparent. The bunker represents a part of Ford's research infrastructure that was kept entirely separate from his main operation. The Mystery Shack sat over his primary lab, which was the location of the portal and the bulk of his equipment. But the bunker, hidden in the woods at a distance, was where he kept the things that were too dangerous to keep close. Experiments and entities and specimens that he had decided needed to be locked away rather than studied in his daily workspace. Whatever Ford chose to put in the bunker rather than the main lab, he had made a specific assessment that the main lab was not secure enough to contain it. The most significant thing in the bunker is the shapeshifter, an entity capable of perfectly replicating the appearance and voice of any creature it has observed. Ford's notes describe it in terms that suggest it was among the most dangerous things he encountered during his time in Gravity Falls. Not because of its offensive capabilities, but because of what its existence implies about the limits of verification. If there's an entity that can look and sound exactly like any person, then anyone could be the shapeshifter at any given moment. The epistemological threat is total. You cannot trust your own perceptions of the people around you, because those perceptions can be perfectly counterfeited. The episode plays brilliantly with this premise, staging a sequence in which the shapeshifter adopts the form of each character in turn, using perfect mimicry to try to isolate and manipulate them. When it takes Wendy's form for Dipper's benefit, it knows what Wendy would say and how Wendy would move, and what specific things Wendy might say to Dipper that would lower his guard most effectively. It is not just a visual copy. It is a behavioral model, a fully functional simulation of a person being operated by something that is not them. This is disturbing in the way that the best horror is disturbing. Not because it threatens physical harm, but because it undermines the basic reliability of perception. The assumption that the face you're looking at corresponds to the person you think you know. The shapeshifter is defeated and locked back into its cryogenic tube at the end of the episode. And then, as far as the show is concerned, it stays there. For the remainder of the series. Through Weirdmageddon, through Bill's transformation of the town, through everything. The show does not return to it. It does not address what happened to the bunker or its contents during the apocalypse. It does not confirm or deny whether the shapeshifter was among the supernatural creatures that eventually sheltered in the Mystery Shack, or was swept up in Weirdmageddon's chaos or remained in its tube undisturbed while the world ended around it. An entity capable of perfectly replicating any person, currently unaccounted for in the restored Gravity Falls, is not a small detail to leave unaddressed. The shapeshifter, in its final appearance, threatened Dipper with a specific fate. It would assume his form, and nobody would ever know the difference. This was delivered as a villain's taunt, rather than an actionable plan, since the shapeshifter was defeated before it could follow through. But the shapeshifter is still out there. Whether that threat is still operational is a question the show leaves with complete silence. The bunker also contained other things that the episode does not fully inventory. There are doors that the characters don't open, storage chambers that aren't examined. The scope of what Ford had locked away there, across the full run of his research, is not known. His notes suggest that the bunker was his containment facility for experiments that proved too unpredictable to maintain in the main lab. Given the range of Ford's research and the length of time he was active in Gravity Falls before the portal accident, the bunker's full contents could represent a significant catalog of supernatural phenomena and entities, most of which the show never depicts. Among the things we know Ford built and tested during his years in Gravity Falls: the electron carpet, capable of swapping the minds between two bodies that stand on it simultaneously, which Stan accidentally activates in Season 1 with increasingly chaotic results. A mind-controlling tie he apparently designed for the purposes of influencing a presidential election candidate named Ronald Reagan. A device for remotely operating another person's body. various weapons and defensive tools designed for use against specific supernatural entities. What happened to all of this technology in the aftermath of Weirdmageddon is not stated. Ford left with Stan on the Stan-O War too. Did he take any of it? Did he leave it all behind? The Mystery Shack, with Seuss in charge and the twins back in California, presumably sits over a basement full of some of the most dangerous technology in the continental United States. Dipper's real name is the most personal, unresolved mystery in the show, and the one that has generated the most sustained fan discussion because it is the most intimate. Every other mystery in Gravity Falls is about the world, about the portal or the Northwest or the dimensional mechanics of the valley. Dipper's real name is about one person. Who is this kid exactly, and what does the name he chooses not to use say about the name he chooses? The nickname Dipper comes from a birthmark on his forehead in the shape of the Big Dipper constellation. This is stated explicitly in the show. The character known as Dipper has an actual given name that his parents put on his birth certificate that nobody in the show consistently calls him, that the show itself deliberately withholds as a piece of sustained mystery. Alex Hirsch built this gap in the character's identity intentionally, and his statements about it across years of convention appearances and interviews constitute their own kind of puzzle. The official published replica of Journal 3, a piece of official merchandise designed to function as a prop replica of the journal Dipper carries in the show, includes passages that refer to the character as Mason. This is the most frequently cited near-canonical source for the name. At various convention appearances, Hirsch has stated that the character's name is definitively not Michael, not Alex, not Mabel, and not Bill, which is a list that answers nothing while giving the impression of answering something. Hirsch has also referred to Dipper as Mason in certain contexts, reinforcing the Journal 3 reading as the most reliable answer available. The deliberate withholding of this name is itself the statement. In a show about identity, about what you choose to call yourself versus what you are called, about the relationship between the name on a document and the person who lives inside that name, not knowing Dipper's birth name is the correct condition. He is Dipper. That is the name he has chosen, the name that emerged from a physical characteristic he was born with, the name that connects him to the sky and to the map of stars and to the sense of orientation in uncertain territory that has been his defining characteristic since the first episode. Whether he was born Mason or anything else is less important than the fact that he became Dipper, and that the becoming is the whole point. In 2026, Alex Hirsch spoke at Emerald City Comic Con about the character in ways that gave additional layers to this question, connecting Dipper's complicated relationship with his name and with gender expression and performance to Hirsch's own experiences growing up in the 1990s, navigating questions about what it meant to be a man. The name question, it turns out, is even more personal than it appeared. It is not just a quirky mystery, but a reflection of something genuine about the character's creator, and about the particular kind of uncertainty that some children carry about who they are and what they are supposed to be. Section 11. The Northwest Family, the Founding Lie, and the Blood on the Walls. The Northwest family claim a single foundational thing. It is the pillar that holds up everything they are: their wealth, their social position, their annual parties that exclude the common people of Gravity Falls, their sense of themselves as the rightful leaders of a community they did not earn but were born into. The claim is this: Nathaniel Northwest founded Gravity Falls. He was there first. The town grew from his vision and his effort. The Northwests are the founding family, and everything that flows from being the founding family is legitimate because the foundation was legitimate. The foundation was not legitimate. Dipper discovers this in the Season 1 episode Irrational Treasure through a chain of historical investigation triggered by Pacifica's dismissive mockery of Mabel. Government documents, real ones hidden in the National Archives behind presidential pardons classified to prevent exactly this kind of discovery, described Nathaniel Northwest as a town idiot, selected by the actual founders of Gravity Falls to serve as the public face of the settlement because they needed someone who would comply without asking questions. The real founders remain unnamed. Nathaniel Northwest was not a visionary or a pioneer. He was a frontman, chosen specifically for his inability to complicate what he was being asked to do. The Northwests have known this. The documents make clear that the cover-up was established contemporaneously with the founding. Subsequent generations of the Northwest family have maintained that lie consciously, benefited from it, built an empire on it, used it to justify every exclusion and exploitation their family has perpetrated across the history of Gravity Falls. They have done all of this while keeping a secret room in their mansion that contains the documentation of their own crimes, locked away but preserved, as if some Northwest at some point could not quite bring themselves to destroy the evidence even while refusing to acknowledge it. The secret room is significant. When Pacifica shows Dipper the room during Northwest Mansion Mystery, he finds documentation not just of the Nathaniel Northwest fraud, but of subsequent acts of exploitation, fraudulent dealings with indigenous people, labor abuses, instances of the family using their position to take from those with less power to protect themselves. The room is a confession preserved in archival form, maintained by a family too arrogant or too cowardly or too trapped in their own mythology to either acknowledge it publicly or destroy it. It is the physical manifestation of the Northwest family's self-knowledge. They know what they are, they have always known, and they have chosen to keep knowing. In private while performing something different in public. The lumberjack ghost who haunts the mansion is Archibald Corduroy, an ancestor of Wendy's, which connects the two most significant secondary characters of the show's second season through a piece of Gravity Falls history that predates them both. He was one of a group of laborers who built the Northwest Mansion on the promise of annual attendance at the family's parties. A promise the Northwests broke as soon as the construction was finished, locking the workers out and leaving them in the cold with no recourse. Archibald died in a mudslide caused by the construction itself, and he died cursing the family with his last breath. He would return in 150 years to exact vengeance unless a Northwest honored the original promise. The curse's resolution, Pacifica pulling the lever, opening the gates, letting the common people of Gravity Falls into the party that had excluded them for generations, is one of the show's most cathartic moments. And it earns its catharsis because it is not easy. It costs Pacifica something real. She defies her parents in the most public possible way in front of their most important social audience. In the middle of the crisis her parents are using her to manage. The bell her father rings, the conditioned response he has trained into her through years of behavioral control, stops working in her for the first time. She chooses something different. She breaks the chain. But the show is honest about what breaking the chain in one moment does and does not accomplish. The curse is lifted. Archibald Corduroy passes on with a final statement to Pacifica that she is not like the other Northwests. The party continues with the townspeople included, and then life goes on, and the historical foundation of the Northwest family remains exactly as fraudulent as it was before the party's gates opened. The wealth accumulated through that fraud and through subsequent exploitation has not been redistributed. The people who were wronged across the history of that family have not been compensated. The show does not pretend the one act of courage resolves the structural problem. It gives Pacifica her moment of genuine choice, gives Archibald Corduroy his peace, and then continues. The Northwest family's historical crimes are not remedied by Weirdmageddon, in which Preston Northwest loses his fortune through his own investment choices. The mansion is sold to McGucket, which is satisfying on a narrative level but is not restitution. The community that was built on exploitation of laborers and indigenous people does not receive back what was taken. This is honest. It is the kind of honesty that children's media rarely attempts. The acknowledgement that one person choosing to be better than their predecessors is morally significant and also insufficient. That it matters and also does not fix anything. That both of those things are true at the same time. The Bill Cipher tapestry in the Northwest Mansion hangs in the show's background as one of its most loaded visual details. It depicts Bill floating above a landscape of flames with rows of figures bowing to him. It was there before Weird Mageddon. It was there before Ford arrived in Gravity Falls. It has been in that mansion for generations, hanging in a locked wing that the family maintains but does not discuss. Someone in the Northwest family's past knew what was coming. Whether that knowledge came from a deal with Bill directly, from contact with entities working in his interest, or from documents or prophetic sources that have since been lost, the show does not say. The Great Flood of 1863 is mentioned. When Ford is ejected from the Northwest Mansion by a young Preston Northwest for bringing it up, the date corresponds to a period in the post-Civil War development of the Pacific Northwest, a time of significant change in the region's human geography. The fact that simply mentioning it is sufficient grounds for immediate expulsion from the property suggests it is a piece of the family's history that is both known to them and deeply inconvenient. What it actually was, a natural disaster, a cover story for something supernatural, an event connected to the valley's dimensional properties, or something else entirely, is never revealed. Ford's notes reference it as something he was investigating before being thrown out. It is one of the genuinely unresolvable mysteries of the show, a door that was pointed at and never opened. Section 12. The theories, the threads, and the questions that outlive the show. The fan community around Gravity Falls has, since the show ended in 2016, maintained itself with a persistence and a seriousness that speaks to the quality of what the show built. It is not simply nostalgia, though nostalgia plays its role. It is the fact that the show was designed to sustain exactly the kind of continued intensive engagement that its community has given it. The mysteries were not resolved fully. The world was not completely mapped. The codes were not all decoded. The implications of the mythology extend in directions that 40 episodes could not follow. Gravity Falls was always larger than the time it had, and the fan community exists in the space between what the show contained and what it implied. Let us go through the most significant remaining mysteries carefully, the ones that have been discussed and analyzed and theorized about and not resolved across years of collective attention. The axolotl is perhaps the most significant unresolved element in the show's entire cosmological architecture. It appears briefly, described in a poem delivered in response to Dipper's question about Bill Cipher, in the Choose Your Own Adventure book Dipper and Mabel and the Curse of the Time Pirate's Treasure, which occupies a semi-canonical position in the show's extended universe. The poem is delivered by the axolotl itself, described as an entity whose power ranks massively above that of Time Baby, Bill Cipher, and any other supernatural force the show has directly depicted. The axolotl exists outside the normal hierarchy of the show's supernatural universe, operating in a space that the show declines to specify. The poem reads, 60 degrees that come in threes, watches from within birch trees, saw his own dimension burn, misses home and can't return, says he's happy, he's a liar, blame the arson for the fire. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. One way to absolve his crime, a different form, a different time. Every line of this poem deserves attention. 60 degrees that come in threes, a triangle. Watches from within birch trees. Bill's presence in the specific geography of Gravity Falls. Watching from the forest. Saw his own dimension burn, confirms the destruction of Euclidia. Misses home and can't return. Confirms that the liberation narrative is false. That Bill genuinely regrets the loss of his home and is unable to return to it. Says he's happy. The performance of contentment. He's a liar. The explicit refutation of that performance by the one being powerful enough to know the truth. Blame the arson for the fire, holds Bill accountable for the destruction, even if the details of how it happened are complicated. If he wants to shirk the blame, he'll have to invoke my name. Establishes the axolotl as the entity with authority over Bill's redemption. One way to absolve his crime, a different form, a different time. The offer of return, conditional on properly invoking the axolotl, contingent on the absolution of his crime. Did Bill's final invocation satisfy these conditions? He did say the word axolotl at the moment of his apparent erasure. He did so in a context that sounds like desperate prayer rather than arrogant demand. The poem says there is a way for him to return in a different form at a different time. The question of whether that way was granted, whether Bill Cipher exists somewhere in the show's universe right now, in some form we would not recognize, perhaps younger, perhaps different in fundamental nature, perhaps without the specific memories and philosophy that made him I named Bill Cipher, is left entirely open. Alex Hirsch has said in various interviews that Bill's story is not necessarily over, that the axolotl operates on a different moral framework than humans understand, and that he finds the question of whether Bill returns to be one he is not ready to answer definitively. Whether this represents a planned future development in a continuation of the show that may someday exist, or simply the appropriate openness of a creator who has made peace with permanent ambiguity, is not knowable. The Time Baby and the time travel dimension represent another significant unresolved thread. The Time Baby, the giant infantile entity who governs time itself from a bureaucratic empire in the year 207-012, a year rendered with a tilde to indicate its connection to a non-standard temporal dimension, is apparently killed by Bill at the start of Weirdmageddon, vaporized with a gesture. Bill himself seems surprised by how easily it happens, noting that he had heard the Time Baby was supposed to be a worthy adversary. The Time Baby's death, if it is permanent, has enormous implications for the structure of time in the show's universe. He governed time. If he is gone, what governs it now? Is the temporal infrastructure, the whole elaborate system of time travel and time police and temporal anomaly correction that Blenden Blandon represented, still intact? Or was it contingent on the Time Baby's continued existence? The year 207-012 and the civilization Blenden came from represent a future that the show depicts through his two appearances. That future is apparently governed by the Time Baby's bureaucratic empire. With the Time Baby gone, does that future still happen? Does Blenden Blandon still exist? If the timeline was altered by the Time Baby's death, what does that mean for every piece of time travel the show depicted, all of which presumably passed through that civilization's jurisdiction? These questions have no answers in any canonical material. The Gompers question has been discussed in the fan community since the show's first season and remains officially unresolved. Gompers is Stan's GOAT. He appears in virtually every episode, usually briefly, almost always in the background, frequently doing something that raises an eyebrow if you're paying attention. He appears in places that seem inaccessible to a GOAT. He makes eye contact at dramatically significant moments. In certain episodes, particularly episodes involving significant supernatural events, he seems to be watching rather than simply present to my end. He has never been explained. Alex Hirsch has addressed the Gompers question at various points, usually with answers that are either jokes or deliberate non-answers. Whether Gompers represent something specific in the show's mythology, a vessel for a supernatural entity, a creature with unusual properties that simply chose to live at the Mystery Shack, or whether he is a sustained visual gag about an unusually attentive goat, is not known and may never be known. The Jeffrey Canuck memory tube from the Society of the Blind Eye episode is one of those small, specific mysteries that feel significant precisely because of their specificity. In the Hall of the Forgotten, next to McGucket's tube and the tube belonging to Preston Northwest, there is a tube labeled with the name Jeffrey Canuck. The placement of that tube in the most prominent section of the hall alongside two characters whose memories were of the greatest supernatural significance suggests that whoever Jeffrey Canuck is, their memories were of comparable importance. Jeffrey Canuck appears nowhere else in the show. The name is never mentioned again. Whether this is a planted mystery that would have been resolved in a theoretical third season, or a background joke that was never meant to carry weight, is unknown. Given the show's general practice of deliberate placement, a purely accidental appearance in this specific location seems unlikely. There are smaller mysteries that the show leaves scattered throughout its episodes like seeds. The full history of the gnomes and their society, which is depicted as having more internal structure than the first episode suggests. The specific nature of the multi-bear's connection to the broader supernatural ecology of the valley. A creature with an unusual consciousness who had a specific connection to Dipper's arc in Season 1 and then largely disappeared. The mermen who seem to have ongoing concerns about their territory. The various creatures depicted in journal pages who never appeared in any episode, suggesting that the town's supernatural population is considerably larger than 40 episodes could document. The crashed spacecraft question, which we opened with, bears returning to. Everything in the show, the thin dimensional barriers, Bill's ability to access the valley, the concentration of supernatural phenomena, the entire reason any of this happened, traces back to a ship that fell out of the sky millions of years ago. We know it was a spacecraft. We know it was large enough to reshape the valley's geology. We know its impact permanently compromised the dimensional barriers at that location. We know nothing else. The ship that set in motion a trillion-year chain of consequences remains entirely unknown. Its origin, its purpose, its crew, its reason for being in that specific location at that specific time. It may have been an accident. It may have been intentional. It may be connected to entities or civilizations that still exist somewhere in the show's universe. The question is unanswered and may be unanswerable within the show's existing canon. And then there's the question of what happens next. Not for the characters specifically, though we have addressed that. What happens next in Gravity Falls itself? The dimensional barriers are still thin. The town is still weird. The knowledge that used to be organized and curated by Ford's journals is now scattered. Two journals in a dimensional void, one in the same void, the research notes in a basement that Seuss occupies. The systematic study of the town's supernatural properties has, as of the show's ending, been essentially abandoned. The researchers who would have continued it are on a ship in the Pacific. Something will eventually happen. Something will press through the thin dimensional barriers. Something will come out of the forest that Seuss does not have a framework for understanding. Someone will arrive in Gravity Falls, a researcher, a tourist, an accidentally perceptive child on a summer visit, who will begin to notice the things that don't add up. The sign at the edge of town will still read, "Welcome to Gravity Falls." The trees will still be tall and dark. The air will still carry that quality. Pine resin and creek water and something else. Something watchful. Something aware. The show you watched has ended. The town has not. And the most honest thing you can say about Gravity Falls, about the thing Alex Hirsch built in 40 episodes and filled with more questions than any 40 episodes can answer, is this: the mystery is the point. Not as a marketing strategy, not as a content delivery mechanism, but as a genuine statement about the nature of the world and the nature of paying attention to it. The show is built on the premise that curiosity itself is valuable, that looking more carefully at things, at the background of a scene, at a string of letters in the credits, at the specific behavior of a goat, at the implications of an ancient crash site, at the reason a particular name is always withheld, changes the person who does the looking, not by giving them answers, by giving them better questions. There is a version of the world that looks like Gravity Falls, if you pay sufficient attention. A version in which the sign at the edge of the ordinary says north of normal and west of weird. And beyond it, something is waiting that has no name yet. Something old and cold and enormous. Something that watched you long before you ever thought to look for it. The show trained you to notice that version, to sit with it rather than dismiss it, to find it not terrifying, but extraordinary, not something to look away from, but something to sit down in front of and pay careful attention to, with a notebook in your hand and the willingness to be surprised. Gravity Falls is not over. It is still out there. In the mountains of Oregon, in the forests that close in around the narrow, winding roads, in the space between what has been explained and what remains, patient and quiet, and absolutely certain that someone will eventually be curious enough to come looking. The pine trees are still watching. Tonight, at least, they're on your side. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I need you to know that means the absolute world to me. These mysteries have kept people up for years, and I genuinely hope they've helped carry you gently into sleep tonight instead. Drop a comment with your favorite Unsolved Gravity Falls mystery. I read every single one, and I love knowing which questions you're still sitting with in the quiet. Please subscribe if this is your kind of content. It keeps this channel alive and lets me keep making these long, slow, atmospheric journeys through the shows and worlds we love. There is so much more to explore. Sleep well. End of script extended section. Bill Cipher's deeper lore, the deals he made, and the people he ruined. Before Bill Cipher ever showed up in a mindscape to work his particular brand of charming menace, he had already been active in the world of the living for a very, very long time. The show gives us glimpses of this history in scattered fragments, moments of revelation embedded in dialogue and background imagery, and the decoded credit messages in the pages of the journals that the show occasionally shows us in close-up. If you gather all those fragments together and hold them against the light, the shape that emerges is of a being who has been patient and systematic in a way that goes beyond any single plan. Bill Cipher does not think in terms of one scheme or one outcome. He thinks in terms of networks, in terms of positioning, in terms of making sure that at any given moment, across any number of possible timelines or dimensional configurations, there are at least 3 different ways for him to get what he needs. The deals he made before the events of the show are partially documented in Journal 2, which Gideon had in his possession throughout the first season. Gideon used the journal's instructions for summoning Bill to bring the entity into a mindscape for the first time in the show's narrative, specifically to access Stan's mind and recover the combination to the safe that contained the deed to the Mystery Shack. This is a remarkable moment of convergence. A 9-year-old child using a journal written 30 years earlier by a researcher who had been trying to protect the town to summon the entity that researcher had been trying to contain in service of a petty real estate dispute. The scale mismatch between what Bill is and what he is being asked to do in that scene tells you everything about how he operates. He is willing to appear useful for small things because small things connect to larger things if you are patient enough and can see far enough ahead. The show hints at other deals Bill made across the history of Gravity Falls. deals that predated Ford and extended backward into the town's earlier history. The Northwests, with their tapestry depicting Bill, may have been deal makers. The cave paintings suggest that the ancient inhabitants of the valley had direct enough encounter with Bill to paint his image in stone, which means, at minimum, that he had been attempting contact in that location for centuries before Ford arrived. What those contacts produced, whether Bill had successfully manipulated anyone in that valley into serving his purposes before Ford's arrival, whether the town's history is dotted with forgotten deals that produce consequences nobody connected to their source, is a story the show only outlines. The question of what happened to everyone who ever made a deal with Bill is one the show raises implicitly in multiple places. The show depicts deal-making as having immediate effects. Gideon got what he asked for in terms of immediate access to Stan's mind, but Bill's involvement in any deal always serves Bill's larger purposes rather than the deal-makers. The immediate exchange is almost always genuine. The long-term consequences are almost always not what the deal-maker expected or wanted. This is the fundamental structure of every deal Bill is shown making. The consideration is real. The trap is in what was agreed to without quite understanding what was agreed to. Ford's deal was the most expensive. What he traded away was his judgment, his autonomy, and eventually 30 years of his life, plus the near destruction of the dimension he lived in. He got, in exchange, a decade of what felt like genuine intellectual companionship and the feeling of being understood at a level he had never previously experienced. The trade was objectively catastrophic for Ford, but it is worth acknowledging that the decade of collaboration with Bill was also, by any honest assessment, the most productive period of Ford's research career. The knowledge Bill shared was real. The guidance he provided was accurate. The understanding they developed of the portal's mechanics was genuine. Bill's method of manipulation was not to give Ford fake information that led him astray. His method was to give Ford real information in a context of manufactured emotional dependency, so that by the time the truth emerged, Ford had already built the machine that made the truth irrelevant. This is a more sophisticated form of manipulation than simple deception, and it makes Bill a more interesting antagonist than a creature who simply lies. He tells the truth mostly. He withholds the parts that would change the calculation. He creates a relationship in which the truth-telling feels like evidence of trustworthiness rather than what it actually is, a form of bait. The deals Bill makes work not because he misleads people about the exchange, but because he misleads them about the context in which the exchange is taking place. The fine print is not in the contract, it is in the nature of the entity making the contract. There is one deal the show depicts in a way that is still generating fan discussion years later. Bill's deal with Gideon. In Dreamscapers, Gideon summons Bill and asks him to retrieve the combination to Stan's safe. Bill agrees. He enters Stan's mind, fails to retrieve the combination because of Dipper and Mabel's interference, and exits. He was not paid. The deal was not completed. But Bill goes along with it anyway, with apparent good humor. Gideon expected consequences for the failed deal that never came. Why was Bill so agreeable about a deal that was never fully executed? The implication is that Bill was not primarily interested in the consideration. He was interested in the contact. Getting into Stan's mind, even briefly, even without completing the stated objective, told him something about the state of the Portal project in ways that he couldn't have known from the outside. The deal with Gideon was reconnaissance dressed as a business transaction, and Gideon never knew the difference. There are also deals that Bill attempted and failed to make, which are in some ways more revealing than the ones that succeeded. During Weirdmageddon, The supplementary material connected to the show's tie-in website depicts Bill attempting to make a deal with Pacifica Northwest, offering her something. The specific nature of the offer is kept vague, in exchange for something connected to the dimensional rift situation. She refused. This refusal is part of what connected her to the cipher wheel. She is among the 10 because she said no to Bill when saying no was possible, which is a different kind of connection to his history than the ones created by saying yes. The broader question of how many people in Gravity Falls history said no to Bill is not something the show addresses. The framing of the show's mythology makes it seem as though Bill operated primarily through people who were susceptible to his offers, who had the specific combination of intelligence and isolation and ambition that made them vulnerable to a being offering exactly what they most wanted to hear. But for every Ford, there were presumably others who encountered the entity in their dreams and either refused or had the framework to recognize what they were being offered before the trap closed. What happened to those people? What did Bill do when someone said no? The show gives us only one real instance of refusal: Ford's eventual, belated refusal after years of cooperation. And that instance ended in 30 years of interdimensional exile for the refuser. What the pattern looks like across centuries of contacts is unknown. Extended section: The Mystery Shack, its history, and the things that never got explained about it. The Mystery Shack is the most familiar location in Gravity Falls, and also one of the most underexplored. It is present in virtually every episode. It is the gravitational center of the show's domestic life, the place where the characters return between adventures, the building whose wooden walls and taxidermy displays and clanking vending machine and slightly drafty rooms provide the sensory baseline of what Gravity Falls feels like to live in. And yet the Mystery Shack itself, as a building with its own history and its own properties and its own possible significance in the broader mythology of the town, is almost never directly examined. We know the basics. Stan took over the house after Ford disappeared through the portal. He converted it, over time, into a tourist attraction, the Mystery Shack, which promised visitors a look at the supernatural curiosities of the Gravity Falls area, and delivered a mix of genuine supernatural artifacts that Stan either didn't know were genuine or chose to present as fake, and clearly fabricated nonsense designed to give tourists something to photograph. The shack is visually inspired by Confusion Hill, a real roadside attraction in Northern California that plays with forced perspective and optical illusions to create the impression that gravity works differently there. The show's creators visited real roadside attractions in the Pacific Northwest as research, and the shack's particular combination of genuine weirdness and theatrical fakeness reflects the reality of those places. What the shack was before Stan turned it into a tourist trap is a question the show raises and then steps back from. It was Ford's house. Before it was Ford's house, it was presumably something else, owned by someone else, part of whatever the property history of that specific piece of Gravity Falls real estate was, before a paranormal researcher from New Jersey decided it was the ideal location for a supernatural investigation. Who owned the land before Ford? What, if anything, had been on that site in the decades or centuries before his arrival? The house sits directly over a massive underground laboratory complex. Was that complex always there, or did Ford excavate it after arriving? The show implies the latter, given that the lab was specifically constructed to house the Portal project. But the precise history of the site is not established. The shack's specific supernatural protections are another thread that the show introduces and never fully explains. During Weirdmageddon, the Mystery Shack becomes a refuge for the surviving residents of Gravity Falls, because it has been reinforced against supernatural influence by Ford's earlier work. Specifically, a barrier created using unicorn hair, mercury, and moonstone that Ford installed to protect against Bill Cipher's influence. The protection works. The shack is the only building in Gravity Falls that Weird Mageddon cannot penetrate. Bill's power cannot damage it or affect what happens inside it. This property, combined with the shack's physical sturdiness, makes it possible for McGucket to convert it into the Shacktron, the giant mech that serves as the hero's assault vehicle in the final battle. But the unicorn hair protection raises a question about the timeline. When did Ford install these protections? He was inside the portal for 30 years. He could not have installed them during that period. Did he install them before he went in? The show's timeline suggests that Ford's final period of activity before the portal accident was spent hiding the journals and calling Stan, rather than reinforcing the house with unicorn hair and elemental materials. Did Stan install them without knowing what he was doing? Following instructions Ford had left somewhere? Did Ford install them in the time between his return from the portal and Weirdmageddon, which was only a summer? Given the events of that summer, when exactly did Ford have time to perform a ritual involving unicorn hair procurement, which required dealing with actual unicorns, which the show depicts as requiring a lengthy quest involving the demonstration of a pure heart, a process that Mabel undertakes and barely manages, on top of everything else that was happening? The Shack's specific protections and their installation history are one of the show's most practical, unexplained details. They are not a grand cosmic mystery. They are a logistical question about the mechanics of the plot, the kind of question that becomes visible when you sit with a story long enough and start asking the things that the story's pace required it not to stop and answer. There's also the question of what is still in the Shack's basement laboratory. Ford's portal is in there. The portal was reactivated by Stan at the end of season 1 and then apparently deactivated, or at least not in active use for the remainder of the show. What is its current status? Can it still be activated? Would activating it again open the same rift that produced Weirdmageddon? The portal is one of the most dangerous pieces of technology ever constructed in the show's universe, and it is sitting in the basement of a building currently managed by a man who is not a physicist, accessible to anyone who could find the hidden entrance. The Electron Carpet, the mind-swapping device that produced such comedic consequences in Carpet Diem, is presumably still in the building too. The tie-controlling device, the various other inventions Ford produced over the years, some of which the show depicts, and some of which are only referenced in background context. The shack contains more supernatural technology than most national security installations, and is protected by a relatively light touch of unicorn hair warding and the goodwill of whoever happens to be managing it that week. This is not a reassuring state of affairs. It is, however, an entirely accurate description of how Gravity Falls works. Powerful and dangerous things exist in plain sight, managed through a combination of ignorance, indifference, and the particular grace of a universe that is not always as catastrophically consequential as it could be. Extended section. Gideon Gleeful, the villain who is never fully explained. Gideon Gleeful is 9 years old for most of the show's first season, and he is one of the most effective villains in children's animation. Not because he is the most powerful or the most frightening. Bill Cipher handles both of those categories without competition, but because he is frighteningly recognizable. He is a child prodigy whose talent is real, whose ambition is real, and whose understanding of people's desires and vulnerabilities is sufficiently sophisticated that he has built a successful psychic entertainment enterprise before reaching double digits. He is applauded by the adults around him. He is indulged by a father who sees him as the family's primary asset. He is surrounded by adoration that he has learned to manufacture on demand. He is also genuinely, dangerously, comprehensively convinced that he is entitled to everything he wants, and that anyone who stands between him and what he wants is an obstacle rather than a person. His obsession with Mabel, which drives the first season's central conflict, is not childish infatuation in any innocent sense. It is possession by another name, the belief that Mabel's feelings about the arrangement are irrelevant because his desire for her is sufficient justification for the arrangement to exist. The show depicts this without flinching and without pretending it is cute. Gideon is the villain of the first season because he is the most recognizable kind of villain, the person who has been told too many times that they are special and has not been told enough times that being special does not give you the right to do whatever you want with other people's lives. His possession of Journal 2 is the specific mystery that the show never resolves. He had it. He used it. He used it to summon Bill Cipher, which is not a thing a 9-year-old with no apparent supernatural background should be able to do casually, suggesting that he had either studied the journal extensively enough to understand its instructions, or that he had some other source of guidance for the summoning ritual. His relationship with the journal, where he got it, what he understood about it, whether anyone helped him acquire or interpret it, is a background mystery that the show uses as an engine for the first season's conflict without ever fully explaining its origins. There is also the question of how Gideon knew about the journal's existence in the first place. The journals were hidden by Ford with the intention of making them difficult to find. Journal 3 ended up in an attic, which is conceivable as a place a journal might naturally end up over decades. But how did Journal 2 end up accessible to a child in Gravity Falls? Someone had it at some point before Gideon did. Either they chose to give it to him or they lost it, or they died and it became unmoored from whatever safekeeping they had maintained. The chain of custody for Journal 2 between Ford's hiding of it and Gideon's possession of it is never established. After his imprisonment and after Weirdmageddon, Gideon appears at the celebration of Bill's defeat looking genuinely different. The show depicts his apparent reformation as real, or at least as the beginning of something real. A child who had been through the specific horror of being forced to dance in the service of an entity that had no interest in him except as entertainment, who had been reduced from a boy who believed his will was the most important thing in any room to a boy who had learned what it actually felt like to be powerless. Whether that experience produced lasting change, whether the Gideon who waves from the crowd at the finale is the beginning of a genuinely different person, or simply a boy who has been frightened into temporary compliance, is left to the viewer to determine. His future in Gravity Falls, in a town where everyone knows him as the child villain who tried to steal a tourist trap through supernatural means, is a story the show declines to tell. He was 9 years old when most of his worst actions happened. The people of Gravity Falls watched him do those things, and then watched him dance for Bill Cipher, and then watched the world get saved by the family he spent a season trying to destroy. What does growing up as Gideon Gleeful in Gravity Falls look like in the years after the summer? The show's grace note for him is a single moment of apparent sincerity in the finale's crowd scene, and then nothing more. Extended section: the creatures of the forest and the ecology of a supernatural town. One of the things that makes Gravity Falls feel like a real place rather than simply a setting is the suggestion that its supernatural population has an internal ecology, that the gnomes and the mermen and the manotaurs and the ghosts and the various other entities the journals describe are not simply isolated encounters but part of an interconnected ecosystem of supernatural life that has its own dynamics, its own hierarchies, its own history in the valley. The show never has time to fully explore this ecosystem, but the glimpses it provides suggest a world significantly richer and more coherent than the episodic Monster of the Week format might imply. The gnomes are the first supernatural creatures Dipper and Mabel encounter in the show, and the encounter establishes several things about how the show's supernatural ecology works. The gnomes have a society with a degree of organization. They have a leader, Jeff, who speaks for the collective, and a collective purpose that extends beyond simple mischief. Their stated project at the start of the show is finding a queen, a goal that they pursue with bureaucratic diligence and with complete indifference to the preferences of the person they have targeted for the role. They are, like, in a specific sense, not evil. They have a goal and they are pursuing it through means that seem rational to them, even if those means involve kidnapping a 12-year-old girl and pressuring her through like implied supernatural threat. The gnomes also reappear in subsequent episodes and in the background of others in ways that suggest their activity in the town continues regardless of their encounters with the Pines family. They steal pies, they attempt other projects. Their political situation, Jeff's leadership, the collective's relationship to individual gnomes who might have a different opinions about the queen-seeking project, is hinted at but not developed. The show treats them as comic relief with a surprisingly complete conceptual foundation. The gnomes have a whole thing going on. The show just doesn't have time to show most of it. The Manitors, depicted in the episode Dipper versus Manliness, represent a supernatural community with their own values and social structure that exists entirely in the forest, separate from the human community of the town. Their society is built around a specific and extremely narrow definition of strength and worth, a parody of toxic masculinity rendered in the bodies of bull-headed forest giants. They are funny, and they are also a fairly pointed critique of certain kinds of masculine social structure. But the broader question of what their relationship is to the rest of Gravity Falls' supernatural ecology, whether they interact with the gnomes or the mermen or any of the other supernatural inhabitants of the valley, whether they have a history with the town that predates the show's events, is never addressed. The multi-bear is one of the show's most specific and most touching secondary supernatural characters. A bear with multiple heads who lives in a cave in the forest, and whose primary desire, when Dipper finally reaches him at the end of a quest, is simply to be allowed to listen to a specific pop song without being judged for liking it. The show uses the multi-bear to make a pointed statement about the gap between the idea of strength and actual personal authenticity, and the statement lands with unusual precision. But the multi-bear's place in the valley's supernatural history, his relationship with the other creatures, whether he has any specific significance beyond his role in that one episode, is left entirely unexplored. Ford's journals contain entries for creatures that never appear in any episode, a weremaid, which Ford describes as one of many examples of why some animals should not breed. Various unnamed entities referenced in passing. The clear implication is that the journals contain far more information than the show ever had time to dramatize, that the supernatural population of the Gravity Falls area is substantially larger and more varied than 40 episodes could depict. The Journal 3 prop replica provides some additional entries, but even that is clearly a selection rather than a complete inventory. What does the supernatural ecology of Gravity Falls look like without human observation? The town has thousands of years of history before Ford arrived and started documenting. The creatures in the forest were there before him. They had their own lives, their own communities, their own histories and conflicts and equilibria before anyone was writing it down. The cave painting suggests that the indigenous inhabitants of the valley had a relationship with the supernatural that was more integrated and less observational than Ford's scientific documentation approach. They were participants in the ecology rather than observers of it. What did that participation look like? What did the valley's supernatural community look like when there were humans living within it as part of it rather than in separate settlements beside it? These are questions that the show touches adjacent to without entering. There are also questions that extend into the actual history and culture of the Pacific Northwest in ways that the show is appropriately careful about. declining to make specific claims about specific indigenous traditions or histories while acknowledging their presence as context. The restraint is correct. The absence it creates is real, and it is part of the larger shape of what Gravity Falls does and does not tell us about the place it depicts. Extended section. Everything we know about Ford's 30 years away. Stanford Pines spent 30 years in a dimension, or a series of dimensions, that were not his own. This is the most significant biographical fact about the character, who is in many ways the show's deepest mystery. The person whose journals Dipper carried, whose identity Stan assumed, whose return was the secret project of 3 decades. Ford came back changed in ways that the show depicts but does not fully inventory. Understanding what those 30 years were actually like would require knowing things the show declines to specify, and that declination is deliberate but also genuinely mysterious. The official Journal 3 tie-in book provides some texture. Ford apparently traversed multiple dimensions during his time away from the third dimension. The portal did not deposit him in a single location. It sent him tumbling through dimensional space in a way that eventually deposited him in a variety of places. Some of those places were dangerous. Some were merely strange. One was described as an alternate version of his own life in which everything had gone right. A dimension where the scholarship had not been ruined, where the relationship with Stan had not broken, where Bill Cipher had never been involved, and where Ford had built an ordinary but comfortable life. He apparently spent time in this dimension and then chose to leave it, which says something significant about his character. Given the option of a life without the specific catastrophic mistakes that defined his actual history, he chose to continue searching for the way back to his actual history rather than accept the replica. Another dimension he apparently visited was one in which every component of language and communication was the letter M, a detail that sounds like a joke, but within the show's mythology is a completely coherent description of a specific dimensional configuration. He visited the nightmare realm, or got close enough to it during his interdimensional wandering, that he had direct encounters with the entities there. He apparently, according to some interpretations of the supplementary material, came very close to defeating Bill Cipher at some point during his 30 years of travel. Close enough that Bill's victory in the third dimension was not as inevitable as it might have appeared. He was pulled back into the third dimension by Stan's portal activation at the exact moment when he might have been most effective against Bill, which is either the cruelest possible timing or exactly the timing that Bill engineered. What we know about Ford's experiences during those 30 years from the show itself is more limited. We know he came back with a specific physical scar, a brand from being knocked into the portal controls during the fight with Stan that sent him through. We know he came back with a beard, and in rough shape, suggesting conditions that did not particularly favor personal grooming. We know he came back angry, immediately punching Stan on his return, which is a reaction that makes emotional sense for a man who spent 30 years displaced from his life by an accident connected to a fight with the person who is now standing in front of him. We know he came back with the same core personality largely intact, the genius, the drive, the difficulty with emotional expression, the specific form of pride that makes it hard for him to accept help gracefully. Whatever those 30 years did to him, they did not fundamentally change who he was. The question of what Ford knows now that he didn't know before, what specific knowledge, skills, and understanding he accumulated across 3 decades of interdimensional travel, is partially addressed by the show's use of him as an expert resource in Season 2. He knows more about the supernatural than anyone else in the show's cast. He understands the mechanics of dimensional travel and the properties of the various entities he has encountered. He has fought things. He has survived things. He has learned through direct experience rather than theoretical research. what the universe looks like from outside the assumptions that any single dimension naturally imposes on its inhabitants. But the specific inventory of that knowledge, what he learned about the nightmare realm, what he learned about Bill's history, what he learned from the alternate dimensions he visited, what he learned about the nature of dimensional mechanics that went beyond what was in his journals, is never fully revealed. Ford returned as a resource that the show uses but never fully documents. He is the character who knows the most, and the show respects that knowledge without exhausting it. When he explains things to other characters, we get the part they need to know. The rest of what he knows exists somewhere in the implication space between his lines. Extended section. The show's endings and what they left deliberately open. Alex Hirsch made a decision that not all television creators make. He decided when his show would end, and he made it end there. This decision was not forced on him by cancellation. The show was performing well enough by any reasonable metric. The fan base was devoted. The mythology had room to expand. A third season, a fourth, more mysteries and more answers, and more of the Gravity Falls world. All of this was possible, commercially and creatively. He chose not to pursue it. He chose the ending he had always planned, and he held to it. The interview he gave around the finale articulated this clearly. He said he had always designed Gravity Falls as a finite series about one epic summer. A series with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that ending, it was the most important creative decision he could make. He cited other shows that had continued past their natural ending, noting that there is a specific kind of damage that comes from going on too long. A damage not just to the story's quality, but to its meaning. The later seasons retroactively changed the shape of the earlier ones. The mysteries that were tantalizing become exhausted. The world that felt large and full of possibility contracts into a franchise instead of remaining a story. He chose the story. He gave up the franchise. And the consequence of that choice is every unsolved mystery in the script. Some of those mysteries are deliberately unsolved. The axolotl and Bill's potential return. Dipper's name. The full nature of the Gravity Falls supernatural ecology. The crashed spacecraft. These are the questions the show wanted you to keep asking. The spaces it kept open on purpose because a story that answers everything closes down into something finite and done, while a story that keeps some questions open remains alive in a different way. Some of those mysteries are the natural residue of 40 episodes being insufficient to tell a story that required, in its most ambitious conception, considerably more than 40 episodes. The history of the valley before the Northwests. The full inventory affords 30 years away. The complete contents of the bunker. What happened to every person Bill ever dealt with? The show got to everything it most needed to say and had to leave the rest in the margin. And some of those mysteries are the particular gift that this specific kind of show, built around the practice of close attention and the reward of careful looking, gives to the people who spend time with it. They are not gaps in the narrative. They are invitations. They are the show saying, you have been paying attention long enough that you have started asking the right questions. The questions themselves are what we have to offer, not more answers, better questions. The town of Gravity Falls is still there. The sign is still weathered. The trees are still tall and cold and dark. And if you stand at the edge of town in the right kind of quiet at the right time of night, when the air is carrying that smell, pine resin and creek water and something else, something old and watchful and not quite ready to be named, you might hear something moving in the forest. Something that has been there longer than you. Something that knows exactly who you are and what you are looking for and is waiting with extraordinary patience to find out whether you are ready to look at it directly. You probably are. You made it this far. Extended section. The relationship between Dipper and Mabel and why it matters more than any mystery. Everything in Gravity Falls is ultimately about Dipper and Mabel, not about Bill Cipher, not about the portal or the journals or the dimensional mechanics of an Oregon Valley shaped by an ancient spacecraft crash. About two 12-year-old twins who arrived in a strange town and spent a summer growing up together in a way that changed both of them permanently, in ways that cannot be undone and should not be undone. The show builds its mythology with extraordinary care, and the mythology is genuinely interesting and genuinely mysterious and genuinely worth spending hours of careful attention on. But the mythology is the frame. The siblings are the picture. Everything that the mythology builds toward, every mystery, every reveal, every confrontation with an entity older than the universe, exists to create pressure on the relationship at the center of the show. The question the show is actually asking beneath all the supernatural architecture is this: what does it mean to grow up? What do you lose and what do you gain when childhood ends? And can you hold on to the people you love through the transition? Dipper wants to know things. He wants to understand the world, to have the framework that explains all the unexplainable, to be the person who figures it out. This is both his greatest strength and his central vulnerability. The drive to understand can be exploited by anything that offers understanding. Bill Cipher offered Ford understanding. Bill Cipher offered Dipper understanding in sock opera, where he offered a deal that would give Dipper information about a cipher in exchange for access to Dipper's body. Dipper, unlike Ford, rejected the deal, but the rejection was not easy and it was not certain. He was genuinely tempted. The temptation of knowing for Dipper is real in the way that temperations to characters are only real when they touch something actually present in the character. Mabel wants to love and be loved. She wants connection, warmth, the specific feeling of belonging to people and places and moments. She is not less intelligent than Dipper. She perceives differently, attends to different things, and her perception is often more accurate about emotional reality than his. Bill's approach to Mabel, when he finally deploys it, is not through the door of knowledge. It is through the door of belonging. He offers her the summer forever because the summer is the most belonging she has ever felt, and she is terrified of losing it. He offers her the specific emotional content that she is most vulnerable to losing. The manipulation is as precisely calibrated to Mabel as Bill's earlier manipulation of Ford was calibrated to Ford. The resolution of their arc, Dipper choosing to come home with Mabel rather than stay as Ford's apprentice, Mabel choosing to leave the bubble she created rather than stay inside it, is the most important thing that happens in Weirdmageddon, not the defeat of Bill. The twins choosing each other over the things they each wanted individually. Dipper choosing belonging over understanding. Mabel choosing growth over the preservation of the moment. Each of them giving up something real and getting something better in return. The supernatural apocalypse is the occasion for this choice. The choice is the point. The show's ending, with Dipper and Mabel on a bus heading home, looking back at the receding forests of Oregon, is an ending about a specific kind of transition, the end of a childhood summer, which is a small death of a kind, the permanent closing of one season of a life. They will come back. The note says so. But they will come back different because the summer has made them different, and that is not a loss. It is the thing that growing up is supposed to do. Not take away who you were, but add to it. Change the shape of it. Make it capable of more. This is the mystery at the center of Gravity Falls that every other mystery reflects and serves. The mystery of what we become when the things we love require us to change. The show gives you Bill Cipher and the Society of the Blind Eye, and the interdimensional portal, and the cipher wheel, and the axolotl, and all of it is extraordinary and worth knowing about. And underneath all of it is two kids on a bus watching the trees go by, carrying everything they learned in the summer. That is the mystery worth falling asleep to. That is the one that stays with you. If you're still with me, truly, thank you. I hope somewhere in these long, quiet hours you found something to rest in. Drop a comment with your time and place. Tell me what mystery is still keeping you up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tonight is the night. The show is over. The town is not. Sleep well. End of complete script extended section. Ford's paranoia, his isolation, and the making of a mark. There is a specific kind of person who ends up in a conspiracy, and it is almost never the kind of person popular imagination envisions. Not the credulous, not the foolish, not the person who believes without evidence. More often, it is the person who is more perceptive than their surroundings can accommodate. The person who notices patterns that others miss, who follows threads that others let drop, who is constitutionally incapable of accepting the most comfortable explanation when the evidence points somewhere stranger. This person is valuable in a universe that actually contains strangeness. And they are also, precisely because of those qualities, one of the most exploitable kinds of person alive. Ford Pines is this person. He was this person before he arrived in Gravity Falls. The perpetual motion machine that started the whole cascade of events in his life was not a fantasy project. It actually worked. Ford was right that it worked, and his high school science teacher was wrong to tell him it was impossible. And the institution that dismissed his scholarship application on the grounds of a perceived sabotage was dismissing a genuine discovery alongside the application. Ford's life has been defined from its very beginning by the experience of being right about things that the people around him insisted were impossible. This history creates a specific epistemic posture. If you have been right about things that others insisted were impossible, not once but repeatedly, not by luck but by careful observation and rigorous thinking, you develop a reasonable confidence in your own perception against the testimony of consensus. When other people tell you something cannot be what you think it is, your experience has taught you that other people are sometimes wrong about this, and you are sometimes right. This is not arrogance in the standard sense. It is a calibrated response to a genuine pattern. Ford's confidence in his own perception is epistemically justified by his track record. The problem is that this same justified confidence, applied to a situation designed to exploit it, becomes precisely the weakness that makes exploitation possible. Bill Cipher did not approach Ford as an authority figure whose approval Ford needed. He did not approach him as a peer who might have equivalent standing in a conversation. He approached him as a devotee, as an entity who had been watching Ford's work from a distance and had come specifically to tell him that everything the dismissive institutions and dismissive teachers and dismissive brother had said about him was wrong, that his perception was correct, that what he had discovered in Gravity Falls was real and significant and deserved the most serious possible attention. The emotional content of that approach was precisely calibrated to Ford's specific wound. Not the wound of general rejection. Ford had hardened against general rejection over years of experience, but the wound of the specific betrayal, the scholarship, the science project, the brother who he believed had deliberately destroyed something irreplaceable. Bill found the exact tender spot and pressed gently on it, and then kept pressing for years, building a structure of validation around Ford so comprehensive that when Ford finally started to see the manipulation, he had to tear down an enormous amount of his own self-understanding to acknowledge it. This is what makes Bill Cipher a genuinely terrifying antagonist beyond the standard issue cosmic threat. The scariest thing about him is not the petrification or the reality manipulation or the army of nightmare creatures. The scariest thing about him is how well he understood Ford. The depth of research and perception required to build the manipulation Bill executed suggests that he studied Ford extensively before making first contact. He knew Ford's history, his psychology, his specific combination of strengths and vulnerabilities. He knew that the way into Ford Pines was not through fear or bribery, but through the specific offer of being finally completely understood. And here's the thing that the show does not linger on, but that is there in the structure of it. The understanding Bill offered was not fake. The intellectual exchange was real. The conversations about dimensional mechanics and supernatural phenomena and the structure of reality were genuine conversations between two beings who were both genuinely interested in the subject. Ford's research in Gravity Falls, with Bill's guidance, produced real knowledge about real things. The tragedy of the collaboration is not that it was entirely based on lies. The tragedy is that it was mostly based on genuine intellectual engagement, and the manipulation was threaded through that genuine engagement so thoroughly that untangling them after the fact was essentially impossible. You cannot simply discard everything you learned from a relationship that turned out to be exploitative. The knowledge persists even when the relationship reveals itself as corrupted. What Ford knew, and what Ford built, and what Ford understood about the universe, all of it is real. And all of it came back to, at least in part, through a collaboration with an entity who had a catastrophically destructive agenda for the third dimension. Ford has to carry that. He has to live in a world where his greatest intellectual achievements are inseparable from the relationship that nearly destroyed everything. The journals he wrote are real and contain genuine discoveries, and also served, through their very existence, Bill Cipher's designs. The portal he built worked and proved his most radical theoretical claims and also opened the way for the near annihilation of his dimension. Ford wins his intellectual arguments with everyone who ever doubted him. He wins them at a cost that would make most people wish they had been wrong. This is the deepest mystery of Ford Pines. Not where he went for 30 years or how he survived or what he learned in the interdimensional spaces between dimensions. The deepest mystery is how he continued. How a person carries the knowledge that their greatest work was used against everything they love, and continues to function, and continues to care, and continues to be willing to trust when the last person they trusted turned out to be the most destructive force in the known universe. Ford does continue. He does trust eventually. Specifically, he trusts his family, which is not the same as trusting the world, but is the form of trust available to someone whose experience of the world has given them every reason to be permanently closed. The show does not explain how he arrived at that willingness. It shows the arrival without the journey. In some ways, that makes it more rather than less moving. Extended section. The show's relationship with time, memory, and the fear of forgetting. Gravity Falls is, at its core, a show about the fear of forgetting. Not the Society of the Blind Eye's engineered amnesia, though that is part of it. The deeper fear, the one that runs through the whole show like a current, is the ordinary human fear that the things you love most will end and you will not be able to hold on to them. That summer will become fall. That the people you belong to will move in directions you cannot follow. That the version of yourself who existed in the beautiful, terrible, strange summer in the mountains will become a memory, and then a faded memory, and then something you can only access through evidence and reconstruction rather than direct recall. Mabel's bubble, the false reality she constructs during Weird Mageddon that keeps the summer frozen in amber, is the show's most direct literalization of this fear. She does not want to forget. She does not want the summer to end. She wants to stay inside the moment she is in. to hold it around her like a snow globe, to keep everything exactly as it is, because exactly as it is the best thing she has ever experienced, and the prospect of it ending is intolerable. The bubble she creates is not a comfortable prison. It is her attempt to solve an unsolvable problem: how to keep something beautiful from being over. The show's answer is gentle but uncompromising. You cannot keep it from being over. The summer will end. The people you love will change, and you will change, and the specific configuration of this moment will not persist. What you can do, the only thing you can do, is remember it. Not preserve it in stasis, not keep it from changing, but remember it with the fullness and the accuracy and the love that Mabel puts into the scrapbook that eventually brings Stan back from total memory loss. Memory is not the same as the thing remembered, but it is what we have. And in the show's cosmology, it turns out to be enough. Stan's memory recovery through the scrapbook is the most emotionally complete thing the show does. Mabel made the scrapbook over the course of the summer because that is the kind of person she is. Someone who understands that moments need to be documented, that the evidence of experience has value even when the experience is ongoing, even when there is no crisis requiring proof, just because the experience is worth recording. She made it without knowing she would need it. She made it out of love and out of the habit of love. And then when the moment came that required it, the habit of love turned out to be sufficient to restore a person from the complete erasure of everything they had ever been. The show's treatment of memory as something that can be stolen, sold, erased, preserved in glass capsules, reconstructed from external evidence, and ultimately irreplaceable is one of its most thematically coherent threads. Memory is everywhere in the show as both plot mechanism and as subject. The Society of the Blind Eye steals it. Dipper restores it. Ford loses decades of his life to a dimension without continuous time and recovers them imperfectly. Stan loses everything at once and gets it back through the love of people who had paid attention to who he was. The show says, across all of these instances, memory is not infallible, and it is not indestructible, and it is not the same as experience. But it is the thing that makes experience meaningful after the fact. The thing that makes the past not simply over, but still present in a form that can be returned to and built on. The cryptograms are memory, in a way. They are Alex Hirsch's bet that someone would be paying enough attention to the experience of watching this show to want to preserve it, to decode it, to write it down, to share it, to build a community around the shared record of having been present for this particular summer. The bet paid off. The community that formed around Gravity Falls is, in the show's own terms, a community of people who decided that what they had experienced deserved to be documented and preserved and returned to, who said with their attention and their effort, this was worth remembering. Which brings us to why we are here. Why this script exists and why you are listening to it at whatever hour of night finds you, in whatever corner of the world you are in, with whatever distance of time between you and your first encounter with these mysteries. You are here because the show left something in you that you did not want to lose. Something that is worth returning to even years later, even in the dark, even when all you are doing is following the voice that follows the voice that follows the journal back into the forest. The journal was there in the attic, behind the loose board, waiting. The question was always whether someone curious enough would come looking. You did. That is the whole answer. That is, you came looking, and you are still here. Extended section. What we know, what we don't, and how to sit with both. Let us take stock. Across everything we have covered tonight, the town and its foundations, the journals and their histories, Bill Cipher and Euclidia and the Nightmare Realm, the Society of the Blind Eye and the Hall of the Forgotten, the Pines family and glass shard beach and the portal in the basement, the cipher wheel and the prophecy that failed for the most human possible reason, Weird Mageddon and the snow globe and the memory gun, the fates of everyone the show left behind, the codes in the credits, and the show that talked to its own audience, the bunker and the shapeshifter and the name that never gets spoken, the Northwest family and the founding lie and the blood on the walls, the theories and the threads and the questions that outlive the show. What do we actually know? We know that the town of Gravity Falls, Oregon, sits in a valley that was reshaped by an extraterrestrial spacecraft crash millions of years ago, and that this crash permanently compromised the dimensional barriers of the location, making it the point of weakest resistance between the third dimension and adjacent dimensions, including the Nightmare Realm. We do not know whose spacecraft it was, where it came from, or whether its crew or their descendants are still somewhere in the universe. We know that Bill Cipher is a triangular interdimensional entity over 1 trillion years old, who originated in the second dimension, destroyed that dimension, migrated to the Nightmare Realm, and spent an enormous span of time manipulating susceptible individuals in the third dimension to create the conditions for a dimensional merger that would give him a new home as his old one collapsed. We do not know with certainty whether he survived his apparent erasure from Stan's mind, though his invocation of the axolotl at the moment of defeat suggests a possible path of return that the axolotl itself has described as available. The stone form of his physical body remains somewhere in the Gravity Falls forest. We know that Stanford Pine spent 30 years in interdimensional space after being accidentally pushed through the portal during a fight with his twin brother, and that during those 30 years he accumulated knowledge and experience that goes well beyond what he recorded in his journals. We do not know the full inventory of what he learned, who or what he encountered, or what he understood by the end of his exile about the nature of the universe and his place in it. We know that Fiddlefer McGucket founded the Society of the Blind Eye in 1982, used a memory erasing device on himself 17 times in 17 days, and spent 30 years of progressive mental deterioration before being partially restored through the recovery of his memory tubes in Season 2. We do not know whether his restoration was complete, what his long-term recovery looked like, or what became of the Hall of the Forgotten and the decades of extracted supernatural memories still stored in it. We know that the cipher wheel represents 10 individuals whose combined resonance was supposed to be sufficient to defeat Bill Cipher, and that the attempt to use it failed due to the very human inability of two brothers to hold their resentments together for 60 more seconds at the worst possible moment. We do not know who originally designed the wheel, what exactly they knew about Bill's weakness, whether they anticipated the wheel's failure, or what the specific reason for each of the 10 individuals' inclusion is. Particularly Robbie Valentino, whose connection to the wheel's symbolic logic is the one the show never explicitly provides. We know that Dipper Pines' real name is almost certainly Mason, based on the Journal 3 prop replica and various statements from Alex Hirsch, but that this has never been stated unambiguously within the show's canonical text, and that the withholding of the name is deliberate and meaningful rather than an oversight. We do not know exactly why the name matters beyond what can be inferred from the show's thematic treatment of identity, self-naming, and the relationship between the person you are born as and the person you choose to become. We know that the shapeshifter is still in the bunker, in its cryogenic tube, unaccounted for in the aftermath of Weird Mageddon. We do not know whether the tube survived Weird Mageddon intact, whether the shapeshifter is still contained, or what would happen if it were not. We know that the axolotl is a being of power that exceeds anything the show directly depicts, that it described Bill's situation with specific compassion for his grief and specific conditionality for his redemption, and that Bill invoked its name at the apparent moment of his erasure. We do not know whether the invocation was sufficient, whether it was heard, or what form a different time and different form might take for an entity whose previous form was a one-eyed triangle in a top hat who burned his home dimension down. We know that See You Next Summer was written on a piece of paper by Wendy Corduroy and handed to Dipper Pines and signed by all the people who mattered to him from that summer, and that the show never depicted a next summer because the show ended exactly where it was supposed to end. We do not know what happened when September came and then the school year and then summer again, whether the Pines family returned to the Mystery Shack, whether Seuss called them when something came out of the forest he didn't have a name for, whether Pacifica eventually found a way to be herself without the Northwest wealth and the Northwest name as scaffolding. We know that the town is still there. We know it is still strange. We know the sign at the edge of it still reads what it reads. And the trees are still tall, and the air still carries that particular quality of watchful attention that has no name but that you would recognize if you breathed it. We know these things because the show made them true in the way that stories make things true. Not as facts about the physical world, but as facts about the world of the imagination, which is a real world, which is a world you have been living in for as long as you have been paying attention. The questions remain. They will always remain. That is not a failure. That is the show's most lasting gift. The reminder that the best mysteries are not puzzles to be solved and shelved. They're places to return to, rooms that are always lit, always open, always holding some you haven't quite seen yet, even after you've seen everything they appear to contain. The pine trees are standing, the creek is running. Somewhere in the forest, a stone triangle with a top hat is slowly being reclaimed by the Oregon undergrowth, patient and cold and dreaming of 60 degrees that come in threes. And you are here, and you are warm, and you are drifting towards sleep in a world that contains somewhere a small town full of impossible things. That's enough for tonight. That will always be enough. Sleep well.